en donnant toutes les informations, tous les aspects qui assurent le fait que nous sommes bien dans le cadre de l'observation des règles. J'aimerais et je souhaiterais les répéter ce matin. D'abord, pour ce qui concerne les précédents, il y en a. Certains de mes prédécesseurs ont organisé dans la salle 20 des consultations informelles sur un certain nombre de sujets. Deuxièmement, pour assurer le caractère complètement informel des consultations, des discussions que je compte organiser avec un panel de très haut niveau, nous avons eu un écho exceptionnel d'ailleurs à cet égard, les règles suivantes seront observées. Il n'y aura pas d'enregistrement de nos débats, non plus d'interprétation. Il n'y aura pas de liste officielle des orateurs. Il n'y aura pas les plaques nommément concernant les différentes délégations. Voilà donc, je pense que tous ces éléments ont été mis au courant et cela allait de soi. Par rapport à notre programme de travail, vous l'avez bien voulu le souligner, Monsieur l'ambassadeur, il s'agit juste d'une disposition qui fera en sorte que nous ne perdrons pas une seule minute dans le cadre de notre travail officiel. Le fait juste d'accommoder le nombre important de panélistes de haut niveau m'a conduit à demander à cet ajustement. Voilà. D'autant plus, naturellement, que le programme de travail que nous allons adopter ne figure aucun élément sur ces discussions que je me propose d'organiser jeudi prochain, à laquelle je vous convie tous, naturellement en soulignant l'importance du sujet, son caractère extrêmement urgent. Nous vivons tous les jours, nul besoin d'y insister. Je pense que la priorité aujourd'hui est d'abord d'écouter Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire sur le caractère pressant, mondial des sujets que nous allons aborder, encore une fois d'une manière informelle, libre aux délégations de juger ce qu'il adviendra de donner comme suite à nos discussions. Moi-même, en tant que président, j'assumerai mes responsabilités à cet égard et je vous remercie. Voilà. Si je ne vois pas d'autres observations à ce sujet, pardon. Monsieur l'ambassadeur de Cuba, vous avez la parole.
Gracias, presidente. Señor presidente, Cuba concede gran importancia a las labores del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Somos miembro fundador de este órgano y contribuimos activamente al tratamiento balanceado de todos los derechos humanos en este foro. Está demostrado nuestro compromiso y dedicación con el Consejo y su mandato. Sobre esa base, no objetaremos el proyecto de programa de trabajo. No obstante, solicitamos que las posiciones siguientes se reflejen en el informe de la actual sesión. En primer lugar, la discusión informal organizada por el presidente del Consejo no constituirá un precedente a los efectos de las funciones de futuros representantes de la mesa del Consejo. En segundo lugar, la sala 20 de esta sede de Naciones Unidas es la sala oficial de reuniones del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y no debe utilizarse para eventos informales de la naturaleza como la que se ha propuesto, a menos que se decida lo contrario por los Estados miembros. Y en tercer lugar, señor presidente, no reconocemos ninguna conclusión que pueda emanar de la llamada discusión informal. El presidente del Consejo no tiene entre sus funciones ni cuenta con mandato alguno para emitir conclusiones. Eso es algo bien claro que debe respetarse en todo momento. No aceptaremos referencias a ninguna conclusión en proyectos de resolución, decisión, informes o cualquier otro documento oficial del Consejo o sus mecanismos subsidiarios. Muchas gracias.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur l'ambassadeur. J'ai pris bonne note de vos observations. Voilà. S'il n'y a pas d'autres délégations souhaitant aller davantage sur cet aspect-là, je vais donc vous soumettre le projet du programme de travail pour adoption. Il en est ainsi décidé. Dear colleagues, the online for inscription on the list of speakers for our interactive dialogues and panel discussions opened on Monday, 10th of June and closes 24 hours before the meeting in which the respective dialogue or discussion is scheduled to begin. Once the online inscription has closed, delegations may still inscribe or withdraw by sending an email to the list of speaker desk. The list of speakers will close approximately 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate. The online system for inscription on the list of speakers for the adoptions of UPR outcomes will open next Monday, 24th of June at 9 a.m. and close on Thursday, 27th of June at 6 p.m. No inscription will be possible after the deadline. Please take note. For national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, the list of speakers for all debates opened last Friday, 14th of June. May I request that all participants upload the Word version of their oral statements through the online system for the list of speakers. If this is not possible, please send them by email to Conference Services and the Council Secretariat. The Secretariat has just informed me this morning that only half of delegations have managed to do so, so please take care about that. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, allow me to recall that the deadline for the submission of draft proposals for the 56th session is Tuesday, 2nd of July at 1 p.m. The submission of a proposal after this deadline needs prior approval by the Council before it is registered by the Secretariat. Only under exceptional circumstances would an extension of the deadline for the submission of draft proposal be approved by the Council, and for a maximum of 24 hours. I encourage then sponsors to table draft proposal as early as possible. Let me also underline that in accordance with Resolution 5/1, delegations are invited to conduct open-ended and formal consultation to secure the broadest possible support for the initiatives. The broadest possible support. At least one open-ended and formal consultation should be held on each draft resolution and or decision before it is considered for adoption by the Council. In the interest of ensuring the effective participation of all stakeholders in the work of the Human Rights Council, I encourage main sponsors of draft proposals to share draft texts with civil society organisations and other observers that follow informal consultations. Excellencies, a constructive, safe and respectful atmosphere is essential for the Council sessions. However, the Council's mandate holders are sometimes subjected to personal attacks or threats in the course of their work. Let me reiterate that disagreement with mandate holders and their reports can always be expressed, but it is unacceptable that they are insulted or personally attacked or threatened when discharging their mandate. As President, I will support them against any inappropriate attack. Similarly, the active participation of representatives of civil society and national human rights institutions is an essential component of the Human Rights Council. As President, I will follow up on all reported allegations or reprisals and intimidation committed against individuals or groups who have cooperated with the Council and its mechanisms. I call everyone then to take all necessary steps to prevent such acts from taking place in the first place and to ensure that they are promptly and seriously addressed in case they do occur. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, let me also emphasize that the United Nations, including this Council, has a zero tolerance for any form of harassment, including sexual harassment. The UNIC Director General has pledged to implement the Code of Conduct to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment, at UN system events. And Her Excellency Mrs. Mayra MacDonald Alvarez is serving this Council as gender focal point, including for cases of sexual and gender harassment in the Council. Please do note also that I have launched together with the PGA last February here this initiative of training against sexual harassment through online. Please do consider to participate to it to show our will to go this way, to fight against sexual harassment by all our means. Finally, all complaints will be dealt with, of course, promptly. With regard to the accessibility of our work, last Friday I announced the appointment of Her Excellency Mrs. Marcela Maria Arias Moncada, the Ambassador of Honduras, Permanent Representative, as Vice President of the Council, as chair also of the task force on accessibility following the departure of His Excellency Marsilio Scapini Ricciardi. There is also, of course, a focal point for accessibility within the Secretariat. Delegations are requested to upload their oral statement in Word format so that they are accessible to persons with disabilities. Speeches in PDF or other non-accessible formats will not be posted on the extranet. Let me also invite delegations to consider including language mandating accessibility in panel discussions when drafting relevant resolutions. This is the only way to ensure live captioning and sign language interpretation will be provided. I will then stop here with the organizational matters. Excellencies, distinguished delegate, I now declare open agenda item 2, entitled Annual Report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and Reports of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. This agenda item will remain open throughout the session. I now have the pleasure to give you the floor, Mr. High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the presentation of your annual report. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it pains me to start my global update to this Council once again with the cruelty of war. Last March, I spoke of the right to peace. Since then, conflicts have only intensified. Killings and injuries of civilians have become a daily occurrence. Destruction of vital infrastructure a daily occurrence. Devastating and reckless. Children shot at. Hospitals bombed. Heavy artillery launched on entire communities. All along with hateful, divisive and dehumanizing rhetoric. I'm dismayed by the extent to which warring parties have pushed beyond the boundaries of what is acceptable and legal on many fronts, with utter contempt for the other, trampling human rights at their core. In 2023, data gathered by my office shows the number of civilian deaths in armed conflict soared by 72%. Horrifyingly, the data indicates that the proportion of women killed in 2023 doubled and that of children tripled compared to the year prior. I'm appalled by the disregard for international human rights and international humanitarian law by parties to the conflict in Gaza. There has been unconscionable death and suffering. More than 120,000 people in Gaza, overwhelmingly women and children, have been killed or injured since 7 October as a result of the intensive Israeli offensives. Since Israel escalated its operation into Rafah in early May, almost 1 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced yet again, while aid delivery and humanitarian access deteriorated further. The situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is dramatically deteriorating. As of 15th of June, 528 Palestinians, 133 of them children, had been killed by Israeli security forces and/or settlers since October, in many cases raising serious concerns of unlawful killings. In the same period, 23 Israelis have been killed in the West Bank and Israel in clashes with or attacks by Palestinians, including 8 members of the Israeli security forces. Israel's relentless strikes in Gaza are causing immense suffering and widespread destruction. The arbitrary denial and obstruction of humanitarian aid have continued, and Israel continues to detain arbitrarily thousands of Palestinians. This must end. Palestinian armed groups continue to hold many hostages, and in some cases in densely populated areas, putting them and Palestinian civilians at further risk. These hostages must be released. The patterns we have documented raise serious concerns about the commission of war crimes and other atrocity crimes. I call for the binding decisions of the Security Council and of the International Court of Justice to be respected. The occupation must end, accountability must be served, and the internationally agreed two-state solution must become a reality. I'm extremely worried about the escalating situation between Lebanon and Israel. Already 401 people have reportedly been killed in Lebanon, including paramedics and journalists. Over 90,000 people have been displaced in Lebanon, and over 60,000 have been displaced in Israel, with 25 Israeli fatalities. Thousands of buildings have been destroyed. I reiterate my call for a cessation of hostilities and for actors with influence to take all possible measures to avert a full-scale war. The situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. The recent ground offensive by Russian armed forces into Ukraine's Kharkiv region has destroyed entire communities. Residents, many of them older people, hid in basements without electricity, water, or adequate food, as the area came under intense attacks by explosive weapons with wide area effects. Repeated waves of large-scale attacks on energy infrastructure have destroyed 68% of Ukraine's electricity production capacity, bringing the system to a dangerous tipping point, especially ahead of winter. I will provide a dedicated update on this on 9th of July. Mr. President, Sudan is being destroyed in front of our eyes by two warring parties and affiliated groups. They have stoked interethnic tensions, denied humanitarian assistance, arrested human rights defenders, and flagrantly cast aside the rights of their own people. I put both generals on notice for their own responsibility in the commission of possible war crimes and other atrocity crimes, including through sexual violence and ethnically motivated attacks. They are ultimately responsible for the impact of their actions on civilians, including massive displacement, impending famine, and an intensifying humanitarian disaster. It is vital that ongoing mediation efforts, including by the African Union, bring this conflict to an end. Existing civilian initiatives to influence a future transition also need support. These processes must be inclusive to address the causes of this conflict that are rooted in discrimination and exclusion. During my mission to the Democratic Republic of Congo in April, I felt the immense suffering of civilians in the East, including those living in camps for internally displaced people, with continued attacks by armed groups, including the M23, the Allied Democratic Forces, Codeco, and others. Violence must end. Efforts of the government and regional and international actors must focus on bringing about peace, security, and trust. Hate speech and messages targeting people based on their ethnicity must stop, and the perpetrators brought to justice. Accountability is key, and the private sector, including businesses that extract resources, must also assume their responsibilities. While there is a decrease in intensity of hostilities in the Syrian Arab Republic compared to past years, there's no apparent end in sight to the conflict. With ongoing killings of civilians, destruction of civilian objects, sexual and gender-based violence, and arbitrary arrests and intimidation of peaceful protesters. Deaths in custody, particularly in areas under the control of pro-government forces, persist. Syrian returnees continue to face risks such as arbitrary arrest and detention and extortion, both in areas under the control of pro-government forces and in areas controlled by non-state armed groups. In countries that have undergone constitutional changes of power, including Burkina Faso, which I visited this year, Mali and Niger, we see transitions becoming longer and longer without meaningful national dialogue processes and with increasing restrictions on civic space to quash dissent. Moving forward with these transition processes can only be achieved through inclusivity. And in the case of Niger, it also means finding a solution that respects the rights of President Bazoum and his family. Civilians bear the brunt in the fight against non-state armed groups, A militarized approach alone will not yield sustainable results. The social contract between the transitional authorities and people must be restored urgently. South Sudan is a country exhausted by intercommunal violence and revenge killings, widespread attacks on civilians, extrajudicial executions, conflict-related sexual violence, mismanagement of resources, food insecurity and large-scale displacement, including due to environmental factors. All these challenges are exacerbated in a fragile pre-electoral context. I urge the government to prioritize accountability, address localized violence, enhance the protection of civilians, investigate all alleged violations, and bring perpetrators to justice. Haiti is the quintessential example of the spiraling interconnection between entrenched inequalities and violence. Decades of exclusion, poor governance, corruption, and trafficking in weapons have contributed to endemic gang violence and the dramatic situation we are facing today. Health centers, schools, state institutions, and strategic infrastructure have been targeted by gang members. I call for the urgent deployment of the multinational security support mission in Haiti, with human rights safeguards included, to support the national police and bring security to the people of Haiti. I will not speak about the situation in Myanmar, since I will address it in greater detail after this session. Mr. President, we urgently need to find our way back to peace in line with the UN Charter and international law. As of the end of May 2024, the gap between humanitarian funding requirements and available resources stands at $40.8 million. Appeals are funded at an average of 16.1% only. Contrast this with the almost $2.5 trillion in global military expenditure in 2023, a 6.8% increase in real terms from 2022. This was the steepest year-on-year increase since 2009. In addition to inflicting unbearable human suffering, war comes with a hefty price tag. Mr. President, the far-reaching impact of war and conflict on the environment is also undeniable. Burning of land, chemical contamination of air, water and soil, destruction of civilian infrastructure, even the risk of nuclear catastrophe. This comes on top of some of the biggest challenges humanity faces today: climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. And with every passing day, humanity's window of opportunity closes. La Niña and El Niño have inflicted severe damage on many countries, including in Latin America and the Caribbean. 61 million people in southern Africa are affected by El Niño-induced drought and extreme weather worsened by climate change. Malawi, Zambia and Zimbabwe have declared a state of disaster, with more countries likely to follow. I echo the humanitarian community's warnings of a looming crisis in the face of imminent harvest failures. Like most crises, the climate emergency disproportionately affects the world's poor and most marginalized. Countries and communities who have contributed the least to creating it suffer its effects the most, notably in small island developing states, least developed countries, and landlocked developing countries. Climate disasters often collide with pre-existing challenges such as food insecurity and structural discrimination, together with limited resources due to unsustainable levels of debt, lack of fiscal space for public spending, and barriers to access concessional financing. The adverse effects of climate change are already having massive impacts on the enjoyment of human rights. We must be prepared. By integrating human rights into environmental analysis and modelling, we can anticipate the types of issues that will arise, inform decision-making, and minimise the worst impacts. Seeking accountability for environmental harm, including through the appropriate use of criminal law, will help make the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment a reality on the ground. Mr. President, we talk about human rights as the best tool for early warning and prevention. But what does this mean? It means we must take the drivers and root causes of tensions, violence and conflict seriously. Entrenched inequalities, lack of access to basic rights, food, water, housing, education, decent work, a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, systemic discrimination, deficient governance and the quashing of dissenting voices. Globally, inequality has seen the largest increase in 3 decades as poorer countries took a bigger economic hit from the COVID-19 pandemic compared to richer countries. According to Oxfam, the wealth of the world's 5 richest billionaires has more than doubled since the start of this decade, while 60% of humanity has grown poorer. 4.8 million people are poorer than they were in 2019. And the wealth gap between men and women globally, $100 trillion. We are a far cry from the 2030 agenda's promise to reach those furthest behind first. Almost half of humanity, some 3.3 billion people, live in countries where governments spend more on servicing their debts than investing in health and education systems for their people. While Sri Lanka's macroeconomic situation has improved, the impacts of the economic crisis, together with associated austerity measures, are affecting the poorest and already marginalized groups the most. Between 21 and 23, the poverty rate doubled from 13.1 to 25.9% and is expected to remain at such levels over the next few years. During my recent visit to the Lao People's Democratic Republic, I heard about the drastic impact debt servicing is having on public spending on social services, including social infrastructure, social protection programs, health and education. In my visits to both Laos and Malaysia, I welcomed the increased engagement with my office and with the UN human rights mechanisms, and I look forward to building on it further. In Argentina, recent proposed and adopted measures risk undermining human rights protection. These include cuts to public spending, particularly affecting the most marginalized, the announced closure of state institutions dedicated to women's rights and access to justice, and an instruction from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to suspend participation in all events abroad related to the 2030 agenda. I urge the authorities to place human rights at the center of their policy making to build a more cohesive and inclusive society. This also means full respect for the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. Mr. President, a human rights economy is a lever for social justice. It promotes equal opportunities, meaningful participation and investment in essential services. It helps forge trust in public institutions, fostering the social contract. Globally, we need to bring our economic systems from trade treaties to investment agreements, business regulation to development frameworks in line with human rights, including the right to development. This has also consequences for the reform of the international financial architecture. Some promising initiatives are underway, such as the Bridgetown Initiative, the proposed new Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, the OECD 15% global minimum tax rate on multinational companies, and the global 2% minimum wealth tax on billionaires proposed by Brazil as the current G20 chair. This last measure alone could generate roughly $300 billion per year to combat climate change, inequalities and poverty. I hope these initiatives are further triggers of the real transformation that is needed by working together to put human rights at the center of all economic decision-making. Mr. President, systemic racism against people of African descent is perpetuated by systems and structures that are rooted in the legacies of colonialism and enslavement. It manifests in many ways, in terms of socio-economic inequalities and in the way law enforcement and the criminal justice system interact with people of African descent in a discriminatory manner. Clearly, there is much to be done, as illustrated by recent reports. While countries like Brazil, Colombia and the United States of America, for example, are taking important steps to address racial discrimination, issues remain. Racial profiling, high unemployment, overrepresentation and differential treatment in detention, greater instances of excessive use of lethal force by law enforcement, disproportionate rates of maternal mortality, health and housing inequalities, and food insecurity persist in these and many other countries around the world. In countries in the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights also reported that discrimination, harassment, violence and racial profiling continue to be routine features of life for black people. My office's agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality and the recommendations of UN mechanisms, including the International Independent Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in Law Enforcement, offer a comprehensive response to systemic issues. As the coordinator of the International Decade for People of African Descent, I support calls by several states and others to proclaim a second International Decade for People of African Descent, starting in 2025. This second International Decade must be informed by the lived experiences, knowledge and expertise of people of African descent to reverse the culture of denial, dismantle systemic racism in all areas of life, and deliver reparatory justice for the wrongs of the past. I urge states also to draw on the recommendations of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent and on other UN anti-racism mechanisms in this process. Mr. President, tragically, pushbacks on the rights of women and girls continue. Active resistance to gender equality is a key factor in slowing progress, even reversing gains made in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. By 2030, women are forecasted to represent the majority of the extreme poor among those aged 15 and above, an increasing gender poverty gap. I deplore the ongoing systemic persecution of women and girls in Afghanistan, particularly regarding their rights to education, employment and freedom of movement. More broadly, human rights defenders and media workers continue to be arbitrarily arrested and detained for expressing opinions perceived as critical of the de facto authorities. The use of corporal punishment, including mass floggings, persists in violation of international law. Attacks by armed groups against civilians, particularly targeting the Hazara community, continue. In the Islamic Republic of Iran, we continue to receive reports of violent crackdowns, including widespread arrests against women and girls for not wearing the hijab as instructed, as new measures to enforce the hijab law are implemented. The draft bill supporting the family by promoting the culture of chastity and hijab threatens to impose additional restrictive and punitive measures on women and girls. More generally, ahead of the presidential elections, I urge respect for the rights of freedom of expression and assembly and protection of journalists. I also reiterate my call for an immediate moratorium on the death penalty, given the reported spike in executions since the beginning of the year. While I have mentioned only some more salient examples, and there are more, let me be clear. No country is immune from regression in women's rights. Everyone must be vigilant and steadfast in countering this pushback, and with the same determination, challenge harmful narratives, embrace inclusivity, and respect the rights and dignity of everyone everywhere. I once again warn of the dangers of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, as well as divisive rhetoric and disinformation that cast migrants and refugees as the scapegoats for wider challenges in society, including socio-economic issues. This has become particularly fashionable among populists and far-right extremists in election campaigns in Europe, North America and elsewhere. And a lot more work needs to be done to stem ongoing discrimination and exclusion on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Any form of hate speech is unacceptable, dangerous for social cohesion, and a harbinger of worse to come. Mr. President, attacks continue against human rights defenders, journalists and others who seek to shed light on violations and abuses, as do restrictions on civic space. We must do better for their protection. According to data from UNESCO, 72 journalists and media workers were killed in 2023, in large part in conflict situations. Data compiled by my office shows that at least 42 indigenous human rights defenders were killed in 2023 in 11 countries, most of them for defending the environment, their lands, territories and resources. This is almost certainly underreported. In Guatemala, I welcome the government's efforts to establish new mechanisms to strengthen protection of human rights defenders, journalists, indigenous leaders and justice officials as they continue to be under attack for having defended human rights, denounced corruption and called for accountability. In Yemen, however, I am deeply worried about the well-being of 13 UN national staff who, along with dozens of staff from national and international NGOs and civil society, have been arbitrarily detained by the de facto authorities since the 6th of June. 6 of them, including 1 woman, are my national staff and have not had contact with their families, nor has the United Nations been able to access them. This is in addition to 2 UNESCO staff and 2 other of my staff who have already been arbitrarily detained for a lengthy period. The de facto authorities must immediately and unconditionally release them, and harassment of their families must stop. I call on all states with influence to take urgent action to end this situation. The situation in Belarus continues to be very troubling. My office continues to receive reports of restrictions on freedom of assembly, association and expression, and persistent impunity. Over 1,300 people remain imprisoned on politically motivated and vague charges. I urge the authorities in Azerbaijan to review, in line with international human rights law, all cases of journalists, activists and other individuals arbitrarily deprived of their liberty, and to ensure their protection against ill treatment. All individuals arbitrarily detained must be immediately released. A worrying trend in terms of civic space is the consideration or adoption of so-called transparency of foreign influence laws in over 50 countries, including in the Republika Srpska entity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, India, Kyrgyzstan, the Russian Federation, Slovakia and Turkey. These laws risk having serious chilling effects on the work of civil society, freedom of expression and of association. In recent months in Peru, the Congress has advanced a series of legislative initiatives that could undermine judicial and electoral independence, reverse important gains on transitional justice and on women's political participation, and restrict freedom of association and expression. In Mexico, I call on the authorities to ensure accountability for the violence and killings that occurred during the electoral period, including of politicians. I have continued to engage with China on a range of human rights issues, including the serious concerns my office identified in the Xinjiang region. My office recently visited Beijing to discuss, among other things, problematic provisions in China's counterterrorism and criminal laws, as well as the application of national security laws in Hong Kong SCR. My office continues to raise individual cases of concern, and I deplore the heavy sentences given last week to a women's rights activist and to a labour rights activist for exercising their fundamental human rights. I urge the authorities to release all those arbitrarily detained, ensure access to information by family members, and embark on legal reform. I acknowledge the dialogue of the authorities with my office and hope this will contribute to concrete improvements in all human rights. In the Southeast Asia region, there is a pattern emerging of transnational repression, whereby human rights defenders seeking refuge in neighbouring countries have been subject to rendition and refoulement or disappeared and even killed. There are indications this trend may be becoming a global one, and so I urge all states to have zero tolerance for such actions and to ensure full accountability of their security forces. Mr. President, I would also like to share with you some developments on which to build further and which can give us hope. First, last year's commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights demonstrated the strength of our commitment to the universality and indivisibility of human rights. Almost 800 pledges were made to advance economic, social and cultural rights, the right to development, the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and civil and political rights. Many have already been acted upon. For instance, 29 treaty ratifications were made by 20 states, with Kazakhstan, South Africa and Thailand having fulfilled their human rights 75 ratification pledges. More generally, I welcome recent ratifications of human rights treaties by Bhutan, Cote d'Ivoire, the Republic of Congo, South Sudan and Tuvalu. Morocco, Paraguay and Portugal led the launch of the International Network of National Mechanisms for Implementation, Reporting and Follow-up in May, which was their joint Human Rights 75 pledge. A number of countries advanced new bills or reformed their comprehensive anti-discrimination laws in line with their Human Rights 75 pledges. Adoption of legislation against gender-based violence in Dominica and St. Lucia is also welcome. Second, we continue to see a significant mobilization of people around the world demanding change to uphold human rights, equality and justice, nationally, regionally and globally. This includes many young people. It includes people taking extensive personal risk and who are up against numerous barriers. Human rights provide the solid ground on which such movements can stand. Third, the international and regional human rights systems, despite significant constraints, continue to deliver for people. Human rights treaty bodies have been groundbreaking on many issues, notably on the environment of late. Their work is bolstered by that of regional and international courts and tribunals, such as the recent ruling by the European Court of Human Rights that states have justiciable, positive human rights obligations to protect against the growing risks of climate change. The International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea's advisory opinion on climate change is another example. It found that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions constitute marine pollution and that states have a binding obligation under international law to limit temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. A March 2024 ruling by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights held a state responsible for violating the right to a healthy environment and not protecting against business-related harms to the environment. Such courts have also referenced the contributions of special procedure mandate holders, demonstrating the relevance of the system. There are also pending requests for advisory opinions related to climate change before the ICJ and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. These efforts give momentum, demonstrating that the various pieces of the regional and global system reinforce each other, and with that, change is possible. The reforms in law and practice that flow from the work of these mechanisms may not always make the headlines, but they are crucial to laying out the way forward. Fourth, I welcome the increasing commitment of numerous countries to advancing the human rights agenda. Those countries who, despite geopolitical headwinds, have reached out to my office requesting technical support. For example, I recognize the openness of Ecuador to strengthening my office's presence there, and that of Honduras to working with my office to address systemic challenges ranging from transitional justice initiatives to land and environmental protection. I also appreciate the commitment to establish UN Human Rights Regional Office for the Caribbean Community and a country office in Mozambique. Mr. President, in closing, I need to flag one overarching concern. We are seeing increasingly aggressive verbal attacks, threats and reprisals, and virulent social media campaigns against international institutions and mechanisms, including the United Nations generally, my office, special procedures mandate holders, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. This is unacceptable. These institutions were set up and mandated by states precisely to undertake their crucial work. States must facilitate this work and protect it from undue interference and attack. I would like each of us to think hard about how to ensure that the achievements of the multilateral system are not undermined and that we are able to do our job. States gathered in this very room last December, fully cognizant of the many challenges, recognized that human rights are a pathway for solutions. With focus now on the Pact for the Future, I urge all states to ensure that our common commitment to human rights is reflected powerfully and concretely in the summit's outcomes. A strong and effective human rights system is key to effective multilateral cooperation and to building a better future for people and planet. My office is ready to play its part. Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
أشكركم سيد المفوض سامي على تقديم هذا التقرير الهام، تقريركم السنوي أمام مجلسنا في هذا اليوم. أريد أن أذكر أن الحوار التفاعلي حول تقرير سيد المفوض سامي السنوي سينطلق غدا بعد الظهر. أصحاب السعادة هي الحضور الكريم. سننطلق الآن في الحوار التفاعلي حول تقرير سيد المفوض سامي المتعلق بوضعية حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار حول مسلمي ميانمار وكذلك الأقليات الأخرى، وذلك طبقا لقرار المجلس تحت الرقم 50.3. قائمة المتدخلين سيتم إغلاقها بعد 15 دقيقة. والآن أعطي الكلمة للسيد المفوض سامي لتقديم هذا التقرير. سيد المفوض سامي لكم الكلمة، وأرجو منكم من فضلكم أن على الحضور أن يحافظ على هدنة هذه القاعة كي نتابع أشغالنا في الظروف اللائقة. وشكرا. سيد المفوض سامي لكم الكلمة. عفوا سيد المفوض سامي، يجب كذلك حتى يتم تقديم التقرير في الظروف المستوجبة. أطلب منكم من فضلكم أن تراعوا ضرورية الحفاظ على الجو المناسب. سأعطي ربما 20-30 ثانية الذين يريدون مغادرة القاعة كي نتابع أشغالنا. من فضلكم يجب الهدوء، وكذلك لنتمكن من الإنصات إلى السيد المفوض السامي. وشكرا مجددا. لكم الكلمة السيد المفوض السامي.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, as we convene here in the Council, yet again discussing Myanmar, we are bearing witness to a country being suffocated by an illegitimate military regime. Myanmar is in agonizing pain, and the disintegration of human rights continues at breakneck speed. This is a crisis emblematic of a decades-long legacy of military domination, the stifling of dissent and division. And right now, these very same dynamics are playing out in a terrifying form with the Rohingya and Rakhine communities. We are hearing stories of horrific war tactics such as beheadings, midnight drone attacks, the burning of homes as people sleep, people being shot at as they flee for their lives. The military has lost control over a considerable amount of territory, so it is resorting to increasingly extreme measures: forced conscription, indiscriminate bombardment of towns and villages, brutal atrocity crimes. Mr. President, I have just returned from a visit to Southeast Asia. I had the opportunity to hear from Myanmar civil society on the spiraling regional impacts of the crisis and the urgent need for leadership and influence to halt this catastrophe. The Myanmar military continues to gain access to foreign currency and weapons it needs to sustain its campaign of terror, while international financial support for the people of Myanmar is meagre at best. But I also witnessed a profound sense of hope. In my discussions with Myanmar civil society, human rights defenders and refugee communities, it was clear to see there is a new generation of young people from all ethnic communities leading the struggle to create an inclusive vision for the future of Myanmar. In Malaysia, I met with representatives of almost all ethnic communities together. A few years ago, it would have been unthinkable to meet with Rohingya and other ethnic communities around one table. I was moved by their solidarity and shared hopes. In Thailand, representatives of Myanmar civil society and human rights defenders from different communities and backgrounds were also united by a common sense of purpose. Their rejection of the military's seizure of power and violence, their demand for accountability, their desire for a better future. These young people have strong expectations of the international community. They seek for the extent of Myanmar's suffering to be genuinely acknowledged and given the attention it deserves. They hope that funding will be made available to those on the ground to deliver humanitarian assistance and services directly to communities throughout the country. They have risked their lives and livelihoods to help communities in need and resist the repression by the military. And with them, a future is possible. Mr. President, we are witnessing a people's revolution against decades of oppression and violence. In some areas outside the military's control, new local governance structures have emerged, supported by ethnic armed groups and activists alike. They are providing food, shelter, education and healthcare for hundreds of thousands who are otherwise receiving little to no humanitarian support. And they are delivering critically needed protection service in the complete absence of a functioning public system. The Karenni Interim Executive Council in Kaya State, for example, has created a local governance system where 7 members have been elected by the people to respond to the community's needs. I call on all anti-military armed groups to ensure the protection of civilians, defectors and surrendees at all times. Mr. President, the people of Myanmar must be spared more despair, more suffering, more fear. Armed conflicts continue to rage brutally across the country, taking an increasingly grim toll on the lives of civilians. My office is investigating several reported attacks against civilians in Rakhine State and Sagaing over recent days, with large numbers of civilians allegedly killed in airstrikes, naval artillery barrages and shootings. I am very concerned about the situation in Mongdo. The Arakan army this weekend gave all remaining residents, including a large Rohingya population, a warning to evacuate. But Rohingya have no options. There is nowhere to flee. Following a similar pattern in Butidong, where Rohingya were ordered to flee and then the town burned, I fear we are yet again about to bear witness to displacement, destruction and abuses. The military also reportedly ordered evacuation of ethnic Rakhine villages around Sitwe, where they have been conducting mass arrests in recent days. In another instance, the village of Byongpyu was reportedly emptied of its several hundred residents as the military tried to identify men of fighting age who sympathized with their armed opponent, the Arakan army. Men were separated from women. Dozens of men were allegedly tortured, shot and killed. Multiple reports allege that at least 5 women were also raped and killed in the incident. Their village was burned. Hundreds of men taken away are now missing. In a cynical move, the military has pressured and threatened young Rohingya men to join their ranks. Some reports have indicated thousands of Rohingya youth have been conscripted into the very same forces that displaced hundreds of thousands of their community in 2016 and 2017. In response, the Arakan army has exhorted Rohingya to fight with them against the military. They have targeted their communities by forcibly displacing residents. On multiple occasions, they have detained or killed men of fighting age who they suspected of taking up arms against them. These tactics have brought back the shocking images and memories from 2017 of systematic terrorization, persecution and forced displacement of populations. Today, sections of Mongdo and Butidong have been alternately burned. Ethnic Rakhine houses and neighborhoods were set alight, followed days later by the burning of Rohingya villages. And tens of thousands of civilians from these communities have been forced to flee, among them entire Rohingya communities with no guarantees of finding safe haven. Over 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh are still living in limbo, in dire conditions, with no prospect for durable solutions. All this in the face of binding provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice for the protection of the Rohingya, while it examines the case alleging genocide brought before it by the Gambia and other intervening member states. Accountability, including proceedings currently pending before the International Criminal Court, is absolutely critical. The failures to ensure accountability in Myanmar's past transition are now allowing history to repeat itself and are haunting the present and the future. Mr. President, the situation in Rakhine State is tragically just one example of how this coup, which has resulted in 3 years of conflict, has brought pain and suffering to an entire country. The attacks by the military have been and continue to be indiscriminate. Since February 2021, at least 5,280 civilians, including 1,022 women and 667 children, have been killed at the hands of the military. At least 26,865 individuals have been arrested and 20,592 remain in detention. There are now 3 million internally displaced by these conflicts, the vast majority still without proper shelter, without access to food or water, without essential medicines and healthcare, and so many more of the cruel consequences of the military's continued denial of humanitarian access remain invisible and underreported. It is clear the violence must end, the attacks against civilians must end, the forced conscription must end, and the denial of humanitarian assistance must end. I urge all parties to prevent the recurrence of the atrocity crimes committed against the Rohingya in 2016 and 2017. I also call on countries in the region to ensure international protection and provision of adequate shelter, support and long-term access to essential services to people fleeing the violence and persecution. Special provisions must be made for human rights defenders who are particularly exposed and often face transnational threats and refoulement. Nobody should be forcibly returned to Myanmar at this time. We need an urgent rethink of how we can respond collectively to this unmitigated crisis. I had the opportunity to discuss with the leadership of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and Malaysia as the current and future ASEAN chair, as well as with Thailand as a near neighbour. It is time to go beyond the ASEAN 5-point consensus that has failed to stem the violence or restore democracy. ASEAN's efforts must be re-energized and backed by a consortium of influential states to develop a new roadmap that can restore the destiny of Myanmar to its people. This must factor in the new realities of local governance emerging on the ground that can provide building blocks towards a democratic future from the bottom up. Myanmar's people must have a place at the table. This means reaching out to democracy movement and youth, involving them meaningfully in the resolution of this crisis. The new generation in Myanmar, particularly the women's leadership that has emerged, needs to be supported in a visioning process for the future of the country. With more attention, more investment, more political will and more action, this situation can be turned around for a better tomorrow for the people of Myanmar. Thank you.
أشكركم سيد المفوض سامي على تقديم تقرير حول وضعية حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار فيما يتعلق بمسلمي روهينجا والأقليات الأخرى في هذا البلد. إذا سننطلق الآن في التفاعل مع تقرير سيد المفوض سامي، علما أن الوقت المخول لجميع الوفود وهو 1 دقيقة و30 ثانية، وبعد ذلك أعطي الكلمة لأستراليا، الوفد الأسترالي الذي سيتدخل باسم مجموعة من الدول. أستراليا لكم الكلمة.
Thank you, President. Australia is pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of Canada, Australia and New Zealand. We thank the High Commissioner for his report. We share the grave concerns expressed in recent statements from the High Commissioner, the IAMM and Special Rapporteur that detailed targeted attacks against civilians, including Rohingya, which has led people to flee to the Bangladesh border and hampered humanitarian access. We're also concerned by reports of displacements in Buttidaung and call on all armed actors to ensure the protection of civilians. The military regime's implementation of the 2010 conscription law is increasing displacement of people and contributing to further instability and violence. We're gravely concerned by reports of forcible recruitment of children by the regime. We call on all states to prevent or halt the flow of arms, military and dual-use materials, including aviation fuel, to the Myanmar military. We remain resolute in our support for the people of Myanmar. High Commissioner, can you please provide more information on the unique needs of women and girls who are internally displaced and what can be done to strengthen their protection? I thank you.
أشكركم. أعطي الكلمة الآن للاتحاد الأوروبي.
Thank you. The EU thanks the High Commissioner for his report and update. The EU condemns the repressive actions of the Myanmar military. All violence against civilians must cease. Conflict continues to escalate across Myanmar. In Rakhine State, the reported forced recruitment of Rohingya is further dividing communities and bringing to the surface deep-seated ethnic tensions and mistrust, making it increasingly dangerous for all civilians. Ensuring justice and accountability for all human rights violations and abuses committed by any actor is crucial. The role of the IIMM remains key. We recall the ICT's 2020 provisional measures order and the urgent need for compliance with it, as well as relevant accountability efforts in the ICC and through universal jurisdiction. We welcome the appointment of the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary-General and call for greater leadership and coordination of the UN system humanitarian effort on the ground, including through the appointment of a UN resident coordinator. The EU calls on all parties, in particular the Myanmar military, to allow the complete, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all persons. High Commissioner, how important is the flow of dual-use goods and jet fuel in the context of human rights violations and abuses? Thank you.
أشكركم سيدة السفيرة وأعطي الكلمة للوكسمبورغ. سيد السفير لكم الكلمة، علما أنكم ستتدخلون باسم مجموعة من الدول. تفضلوا.
Thank you, Mr. President. This statement is on behalf of the Benelux, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. We align with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his report and we support its conclusions and recommendations. As he states, the human rights situation in Myanmar is in free fall and human rights protection and civilian rule of law are absent. The increasing number of airstrikes and the continued violence towards civilians are causing great suffering among the population. The situation of children's rights is nothing short of catastrophic. In Rakhine, the Rohingya suffering is reaching new heights with the enforcement of conscription law, providing cover for the forcible abduction of Rohingya men out of villages and camps, even beyond Myanmar's borders, to recruit them into the military. These violations and abuses show the urgent need for the parties concerned to adhere to the ICJ's provisional measures, also concerning the safe return of Rohingya refugees to Myanmar, which is currently not a possibility. We explicitly acknowledge efforts to build local, democratic, human rights-based and victim-centered systems of governance and welcome the efforts of the National Unity Government and others working towards an inclusive, democratic future for Myanmar. High Commissioner, you have recently returned from a mission to the region to visit Malaysia, Laos, PDR and Thailand. How can the international community, in particular the ASEAN and OIC member states and other partners of Myanmar, act concretely for justice for the Rohingya and a better future for all? I thank you.
شكرا سيد السفير. أعلن أنه بعد 15 دقيقة سيتم إغلاق قائمة المتدخلين حول هذا الحوار التفاعلي، وأعطي الكلمة الآن لباكستان، الوفد الباكستاني الذي سيتدخل باسم منظمة التعاون الإسلامي. باكستان لكم الكلمة.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for the presentation of his report. The OIC Group is deeply concerned at the resumption of hostilities in Rakhine State and at the recent reports of violence, forced displacement and property destruction against the Rohingya Muslims in Butidang Township in Rakhine. The OIC Group urges all conflicting parties to protect the Rohingya Muslims and ensure their safety and security. We also express grave concern at the forced recruitment and use of Rohingya as a human shield by the warring parties in Rakhine and urge them to immediately put an end to this illegal conscription and allow Rohingya already conscripted to return home. We urge Myanmar to implement all recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, including a clear pathway to citizenship for the Rohingya, fully comply with ICJ's provisional measures and cooperate with all ongoing international accountability mechanisms, allow the full, safe, unhindered and immediate access of humanitarian actors to provide humanitarian assistance, and commence repatriation of the Rohingyas from Bangladesh and other host states to Myanmar with rights, safety and dignity at a suitable time. Mr. President, in the context of decreasing funding in Joint Response Plan, we call on the international community to keep investing in the well-being, safety and dignity of Rohingya and help realize their right to return to their homeland in Rakhine. We also urge the OHCHR to closely monitor the situation in Rakhine and play an active role in pursuing a durable solution to the crisis, including through contributing to accountability processes. I thank you, sir.
شكرا سيد السفير. والآن الكلمة للدنمارك كذلك باسم مجموعة من الدول.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Nordic Baltic states remain deeply disturbed by the frequent and credible reports of serious violations and abuses of human rights and international law in Myanmar. The report speaks of military attacks causing civilian fatalities, including women, children and persons belonging to ethnic minorities, aerial attacks and shelling of homes, schools, places of worship and hospitals, mass killings, persecution, torture and STPV. The forced and prolonged recruitment of conscripts, including forced recruitment of children, exacerbates the civil war. It disrupts society at every level and fuels identity-based violence. We call for an immediate end to all violations and abuses against civilians, the provision of full and unhindered humanitarian access, the release of all political prisoners, and an inclusive dialogue with meaningful participation of all stakeholders. Myanmar must comply with the ICJ's provisional measures order. High Commissioner, what actions should external actors prioritize in the face of rising communal tensions, including in Rakhine? Thank you.
أشكركم سيد السفير وأعطي الكلمة الآن للكويت.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يضم وفد بلادي صوته للبيانات الصادرة عن المجموعات التي ينتمي إليها، وباسم دولة الكويت أود أن أعبر عن بالغ القلق حيال ما ورد في تقرير مفوض السامي قيد النظر، والذي يشير إلى توجهات وأنماط جديدة من انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار، وخاصة استمرار ما تتعرض له أقلية مسلمي الروهينجا والأقليات الأخرى من أعمال عنف وحظر الاتصالات عبر الإنترنت وعدم توفر ظروف معيشية آمنة لهذه الفئات من المجتمع. وإذ نؤكد في هذا السياق على أهمية معالجة الأسباب الجذرية للأزمة من أجل تحقيق سلام دائم وبناء مجتمع قائم على مبادئ المساواة وعدم التمييز بين أطياف المجتمع في ميانمار. إن دولة الكويت كانت ولا زالت داعمة لكافة المساعي والجهود الدولية الرامية لرفع المعاناة الإنسانية للروهينجا والمجتمعات المستضيفة لهم، خاصة مبادرة إعادة توطين لاجئي الروهينجا في بنغلاديش. كما استقبلت بلادي العام الماضي المقرر الخاص المعني بحالة حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار، وتم بحث ومناقشة سبل تقديم مزيد من الدعم الإنساني للروهينجا. سيد الرئيس، ختاما، تؤيد بلادي الاستنتاجات والتوصيات الواردة في هذا التقرير، خاصة الوقف الفوري لجميع أعمال العنف الموجهة ضد المدنيين بما في ذلك الروهينجا والبنى التحتية المدنية والمواقع الدينية والموظفين، امتثالا لقرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2669. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
أشكركم. وأعطي الكلمة الآن لأيرلندا.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the High Commissioner for his update. Ireland is deeply concerned by the continued rapid deterioration of the human rights situation in Myanmar. We are appalled by the perpetration and continued torture and sexual and gender-based violence and the targeting of civilians by the military, including in shelters and camps where they have sought protection that have intensified since October. In particular, Ireland notes with deep concern the dire circumstances faced by the Rohingya communities in Rakhine State amidst escalating violence and forced conscription and recruitment perpetrated by multiple parties to the conflict. Nearly 19 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Ireland commends the ongoing work of humanitarian actors, including ground-up actors, and in this extremely dangerous context. Ireland urges all parties to find a solution to issues of humanitarian access and calls on the military to immediately cease the blocking of humanitarian aid. Ireland welcomes the continued engagement on the conflict by the UN, including through the appointment of Ms. Julie Bishop as UN Special Envoy and through the High Commissioner's recent visit to the region. High Commissioner, how can the international community support and amplify the ground-up models referred to in your report? Thank you.
أشكركم. وأعطي الكلمة الآن إلى مصر.
السيد الرئيس، تأخذ مصر علما بتقرير المفوض السامي بشأن ميانمار وتؤكد إدانتها الكاملة لجميع الانتهاكات ضد أقلية الروهينجا وتعرب عن أسفها إزاء استمرار وضعهم المأساوي، وتطالب حكومة ميانمار بوضع حد لتلك الانتهاكات من خلال اتخاذ الإجراءات الكفيلة بتوفير الحماية اللازمة لهم وإيجاد حل دائم للأزمة. في هذا الصدد تضع مصر كافة الجهود على المستويين الإقليمي والدولي الرامية لتفعيل المحاسبة، وتدعو مكتب المفوض السامي للتواصل والتعاون مع منظمة التعاون الإسلامي أخذا في الاعتبار محورية دور المنظمة في تلك القضية. كما تثمن مصر في هذا الإطار دور بنغلاديش والدول الأخرى المجاورة وجهودهم المستمرة لمواجهة تداعيات أزمة الروهينجا، وتدعو المجتمع الدولي لتقديم الدعم اللازم للدول المستضيفة للروهينجا والنظر في حلول عملية ومستدامة في هذا الشأن. شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Je vous remercie. Je donne maintenant la parole au Japon. Monsieur l'ambassadeur.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also thank you, High Commissioner, for your insightful report. Japan remains seriously concerned about the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Myanmar since the coup. Japan strongly condemns the Myanmar's military's continued failure to try to resolve the situation by peaceful means, while many innocent civilians are killed and wounded daily by air strikes and other acts of violence around the country, including Rakhine State. Japan is seriously concerned that the introduction of a conscription by the Myanmar military would throw the country into the greater turmoil. We once again urge all stakeholders to refrain from the violence and work together towards a peaceful resolution of the situation. It is crucial to improve the human rights and humanitarian situation in Myanmar in a manner that reflects the will of the people of Myanmar. To this end, Japan will continue to work closely with the international community, including ASEAN, and make every effort to improve the situation in Myanmar. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The floor is for Iran now. Iran.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Islamic Republic of Iran aligns itself to the statement of the group it belongs to. We thank the High Commissioner for his report and ask for more concentration in his future report on the rights of the Rohingya Muslims. Mr. President, the protracted and hate-driven a natural disaster that unfolds day by day in Myanmar's Rakhine state has left the Rohingya minority as the main victim and sufferer of the conundrum. With consideration of expanding problems for Rohingya minority, including the increasing number of displaced people, unregistered identities, and right-deprived women and children that are facing existential threats, the dreadful situation of human rights for Rohingya Muslims should be prevented from marginalization in this Council. Regarding the current situation, we expect the authorities in Myanmar to ensure the political, security, humanitarian and human rights of Rohingya minority and exert maximum efforts to improve the socio-economic conditions for the Rohingya minority, mainly by taking effective measures to prevent their misplacement and displacement from their homeland. In conclusion, appreciating the overcapacity admission of the Rohingya refugee by host countries, we call upon consolidation of our common efforts for alleviating the refugee crisis and equally sharing the burden of this plight. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole maintenant à l'UNICEF.
Thank you, Mr. President. UNICEF welcomes the High Commissioner's report and the opportunity to highlight the impact of the conflict on the rights of children. UNICEF is on the ground in Myanmar, where children are bearing the brunt of the conflict. A record 3.1 million people have been displaced, with nearly 40% being children facing multiple rights violations and deprivations. Grave child rights violations verified by the UN continue to rise. In 2023, the number of children recruited and used by parties to the conflict surged by over 498% compared to 2022. The increasing use of landmines and the explosive remnants of war are putting civilians at grave risks, including children, who account for over 20% of civilian casualties. Constraints on access and disruptions to essential services, including health and education, continue to have a devastating impact on children, 4.5 million of whom have limited to no access to learning. Schools and health facilities are increasingly under attack, further shrinking the already limited sanctuaries for children. UNICEF urges all parties to the conflict to comply with international humanitarian and human rights law, to end grave child rights violations, to allow safe, unimpeded and sustained humanitarian access to children in all areas, and to take all necessary measures to prevent and stop all forms of violence against children. We stand ready to support. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne maintenant la parole à la Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone thanks the High Commissioner and his office for the detailed and thorough report on human rights situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar, pursuant to Resolution 53. We express our deep concern at the continuing reports of human rights violations and abuses against Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. It is imperative that we hold those responsible for these violations to account. The pursuit of justice and accountability must be a priority to ensure that such atrocities are not repeated. In this regard, Sierra Leone supports initiatives to bring perpetrators to justice through international mechanisms and supports the continued mandates of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. We commend the efforts of regional organizations, including ASEAN, to address the crisis in Myanmar. Sierra Leone recognizes the significant burden placed on neighboring countries, particularly Bangladesh, in hosting large numbers of Rohingya refugees. We call on the international community to provide continued and increased support to these host countries to alleviate the humanitarian crisis and to ensure that the rights and needs of the refugees are adequately addressed. We also urge the government in Myanmar to cooperate fully with the human rights mechanisms and to take immediate steps to end all forms of violence and discrimination against Rohingya and other minorities. It is essential that Myanmar complies with its obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law, and I thank you, Mr. President.
Je vous remercie. Et je donne maintenant la parole à la délégation de Turquie.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for his report. The situation in Myanmar has been deteriorating since the military coup in 2021. We are concerned by increased fighting and the worsening security situation since last October. The reports of atrocities against civilians in the Rakhine state, particularly against the Rohingya Muslims in recent months, resulting in the forced displacement of thousands of people, continue to be a cause of concern. Rohingyas have long been recognized as one of the most persecuted groups in the world. It is the joint responsibility of the international community to find a lasting solution to the crisis. We call on all parties to the conflict to prioritize protection of civilians and prevent further incitement of violence, and to allow access to the region for the immediate and unhindered flow of humanitarian assistance. Creating the necessary conditions for the safe, voluntary and dignified return of the Rohingyas to their homeland is essential. The ruling of the International Court of Justice on the admissibility of the Gambia's application is also a crucial step forward. We will continue with our relief efforts to the Rohingya refugees, which cover various fields, including health, housing, education, and income-generating projects. I thank you.
Je vous remercie. La parole est à vous, Monsieur l'ambassadeur de l'Indonésie.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are gravely alarmed by the intensified violence and hostilities in Myanmar, which have widespread and further worsened the dire human rights and humanitarian situation in the country. We urge all parties involved in Myanmar to immediately end the violence and take utmost measures to protect the people, including Rohingya, Muslim and other minorities. Indonesia, as a transit country, has long hosted and assisted thousands of Rohingya from Myanmar, including rescuing the victims of capsized boat off the coast of Aceh last March. We note with concern from the High Commission report that the displacement of the fleeing Rohingya were also compelled by unscrupulous traffickers. The trend, whereas refugees are falling victim of national crime, have only aggravated their vulnerabilities and complicated our efforts in dealing with this issue. Mr. President, as part of the ASEAN Troika, Indonesia will continue to work for ensuring the ASEAN 5-point consensus is fully respected and implemented by Myanmar. And in this vein, we urge Myanmar to pursue comprehensive and inclusive solutions to the crisis that also protect and guarantee the right of Rohingya. I thank you.
Merci, Monsieur l'ambassadeur. La parole maintenant est à l'Espagne.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España se suma a la declaración de la Unión Europea. Agradecemos al Alto Comisionado su actualización en esta sesión tras su reciente viaje a la zona y reiteramos nuestro apoyo a los esfuerzos que viene desarrollando su oficina, así como el relator especial y el mecanismo independiente de investigación internacional. El Consejo de Derechos Humanos debe seguir dando una respuesta a la grave situación de violación de los derechos humanos que persiste en Myanmar. Las autoridades militares deben poner fin inmediatamente a los ataques contra la población civil y cesar las actividades represivas en el país. Asimismo, las partes en conflicto deben terminar con la práctica de reclutamiento forzoso, que está afectando directamente a los jóvenes, particularmente en el estado de Rakhine y en especial a los rohinyas, y que contribuye al agravamiento de las tensiones entre comunidades étnicas en el país. Agradecemos a aquellos países vecinos, en particular Bangladesh, que han acogido a los numerosos desplazados que han tenido que huir del país y se encuentran en una situación de gran vulnerabilidad. España reclama el acceso seguro y libre de la ayuda humanitaria, que debe ser respetada por todas las partes. Reiteramos el reconocimiento a la importancia del papel de la Oficina en la prevención y protección de los derechos humanos en Myanmar y llamamos una vez más a una solución de paz duradera. Muchas gracias.
Je vous remercie. La parole est à vous, Monsieur l'ambassadeur de France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, la France vous remercie pour votre rapport qui rappelle une nouvelle fois les exactions massives et délibérées commises par l'armée birmane. Cela fait plus de 3 ans que l'armée opprime le peuple birman. Depuis son coup d'État, elle multiplie les frappes aveugles, les emprisonnements arbitraires, la torture et les violences sexuelles contre les femmes et les filles, la persécution de minorités politiques, religieuses ou ethniques. Le bombardement de l'hôpital de l'État Chine le mois dernier n'est qu'un exemple du ciblage régulier des populations et des infrastructures civiles. Les progrès des rébellions armées ces derniers mois illustrent le rejet croissant de ces exactions commises par l'armée, par la population birmane. La France soutient le mécanisme d'enquête indépendant pour la Birmanie, indispensable pour rendre justice à toutes les victimes, à commencer par les Rohingyas. La France exhorte les autorités de facto à mettre en œuvre la résolution 2669 du Conseil de sécurité, à mettre fin aux violences, à libérer immédiatement les plus de 20 000 prisonniers détenus arbitrairement, y compris la conseillère pour l'État Aung San Suu Kyi et le président de la République Win Myint, à construire les conditions nécessaires à un retour sûr, volontaire et digne des Rohingyas, et plus largement à accepter sincèrement le nécessaire processus de dialogue politique incluant toutes les parties, conformément au consensus en 5 points de l'ASEAN. Nous réitérons notre plein soutien à la population birmane et ses aspirations légitimes à la démocratie. Je vous remercie.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur l'ambassadeur. Comme annoncé auparavant, la liste des orateurs au titre de ce dialogue est désormais close. Je donne maintenant la parole à la délégation des Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Maldives thanks the High Commissioner for the comprehensive report on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Mr. President, the Maldives remain deeply concerned over the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Myanmar. The human toll of the recent attacks by the Myanmar military in Rakhine State is appalling. Cycles of violence, repression, displacement, and the risk of famine continue to be the fate of nearly 630,000 Rohingya. The current humanitarian crisis in Myanmar necessitates immediate action to meet the basic needs of all individuals, including access to food and health care. Mr. President, the Maldives reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of violence and for humanitarian access to be granted to create a conducive environment for the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of forcibly displaced persons. On this note, let me commend Bangladesh for hosting the Rohingya refugees and the Gambia for its efforts to hold the perpetrators accountable at the ICJ on behalf of the OIC. As an intervening state in their case, the Maldives is ready to work with the Gambia and the like-minded countries to bring justice to the Rohingya. The Maldives also welcomes the newly appointed Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General on Myanmar and supports efforts to foster sustainable peace through close cooperation with ASEAN and neighboring countries. I thank you.
Je vous remercie. La parole est à la Colombie. La Colombie. J'espère qu'ils sont dans la salle. Je n'arrive pas à identifier le siège. Très bien. Nous passons donc à la délégation de la Suisse. La Suisse, vous avez la parole.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie le Haut-Commissaire pour sa mise à jour. Depuis février 2021, le nombre de personnes en situation de besoin humanitaire est passé de 1 à 18,6 millions. Nous appelons tous les acteurs à renforcer d'urgence la protection de la population civile et à garantir l'accès rapide et sans entrave à l'aide humanitaire. Des rapports continuent de faire état de graves violations du droit international humanitaire ainsi que de violations et abus des droits de l'homme commis à l'encontre de la population civile, notamment des frappes aériennes sur les infrastructures civiles ainsi que des actes de torture et de violence sexuelle, le recrutement forcé et l'utilisation de civils comme boucliers humains. Les communautés et l'ensemble du Myanmar sont soumises à de nouveaux déplacements forcés. La Suisse condamne fermement ces actes commis en particulier au premier lieu par les forces armées militaires. Nous soulignons la nécessité d'enquêtes crédibles, transparentes, indépendantes et impartiales sur toutes les violations et abus. La Suisse est profondément concernée par l'absence de volonté des parties de s'engager dans un dialogue inclusif pour la recherche d'une solution politique et non violente à cette grave crise. La Suisse exhorte les autorités militaires et toutes les parties au conflit à pleinement et rapidement mettre en œuvre la résolution 2669 du Conseil de sécurité. Je vous remercie.
Je vous remercie. The floor now is for China.
主席先生，高瞻先生，缅甸问题非常复杂，内外因素错乱交织。历史和现实一再证明，只有秉持主权平等、不干涉内政等国际关系基本准则，才能真正解决问题，促进和保障人权。人权理事会有关讨论应当有助于缅甸的政治和社会稳定，有助于缅甸的和平与和解，避免激化矛盾。遣返是解决罗兴亚危机的唯一出路。孟缅均为中国友好邻邦，长期以来，中方积极斡旋，促孟缅双方就启动遣返达成诸多重要共识。尽早启动遣返，对改善孟缅关系、维护地区和平稳定具有重要意义。中方支持孟缅双方继续相向而行，克服困难，排除干扰，尽早实现遣返。谢谢主席。
I thank you. I now give the floor to United States of America. Mrs. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, High Commissioner Turk, for your work drawing attention to the worsening human rights situation in Myanmar through your alarming and illustrative report today. It was devastating to listen to. I can't imagine what it must be to live it. We support your impassioned advocacy in recent weeks to raise the alarm about escalating violence and intercommunal tensions in Rakhine State. The world simply cannot sit idly by and allow the status quo to continue. The United States condemns the reported forced conscription of Rohingya and the targeted destruction of towns in Rakhine, resulting in the displacement of civilians. We call on Myanmar's military, as well as all armed actors, to protect civilian populations in Rakhine and allow for unhindered humanitarian access. The military's continued use of violence against civilians across the country underscores the need for the international community to do more to impede its access to arms and financial resources. We welcome this Council's unanimous adoption of a resolution that calls for states to restrict the Myanmar military's access to jet fuel, and we reiterate our call for all states to prevent the flow of arms to the military. High Commissioner Turk, you have warned that past atrocities could recur in Rakhine. What can member states do to prevent this? I thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. The floor now is for Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bangladesh thanks High Commissioner for presentation of the report. We express grave concern at the recent reports of burning of Rohingya villages in Butidong township in Rakhine, their forced conscription and their displacement. We call on all parties involved to protect Rohingya and ensure their safety and security. Bangladesh is deeply troubled at the recent shooting from Myanmar targeting its people and property. Internal conflicts in Myanmar must not affect the safety and security of our people and property in the Myanmar border. Mr. President, Bangladesh has been hosting around 1.2 million Rohingya for nearly 7 years, despite various constraints. Sustainable repatriation of Myanmar of Rohingyas is the only solution to this crisis. We have continued our engagements with all parties concerned for commencement of Rohingya repatriation. We urge international community to come forward to create better conditions, invest in livelihood options for the Rohingya in Rakhine, and thus help reintegrate the Rohingya returnees. In the context of decreasing funding in Joint Response Plan, we call for adequate humanitarian assistance for the Rohingyas temporarily sheltered in Bangladesh. Finally, we urge High Commissioner and his office to keep the Rohingya issue high on the agenda until the accountability and justice is ensured and a durable solution is achieved. I thank you.
شكرا. أعطي الكلمة الآن للعربية السعودية.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. اطلعت بعثة بلادي باهتمام على تقرير المفوض السامي بشأن حالة حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار، وتطلع حكومة بلادي عن كثب على الوضع في ميانمار، وتدعو أصحاب المصلحة المعنيين على المستوى الوطني للحفاظ على الحوار البناء الذي يسهم إلى حلول عملية. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد المملكة على موقفها الثابت والداعم لحماية المدنيين في ميانمار، لا سيما أزمة مسلمي الروهينجا، وتدعو إلى ضمان سلامتهم وأمنهم والاعتراف بحقوقهم الأساسية دون مزيد من التأخير، بما في ذلك الحق في المواطنة الكاملة وتهيئة الظروف لعودة آمنة وكريمة للاجئي الروهينجا إلى موطنهم الأصلي. كما وقد عملت المملكة منذ بداية الصراع باستضافة أكثر من 260 ألف من الروهينجا الذي تم تقديم الرعاية الصحية العامة وفرص العمل لهم وتقديم التعليم لأطفالهم. ودعمت المملكة أيضا لاجئي الروهينجا في عدد من الدول في المجالات المتعلقة بالاستجابة للإغاثة الطارئة والتعليم والمأوى والصحة. ختاما السيد الرئيس، ستواصل المملكة دعم الروهينجا بالتعاون مع المجتمع الدولي لضمان حصولهم على حقوقهم في العيش بسلام وكرامة في وطنهم. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
أشكركم. The floor now is for Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, Россия продолжает уделять пристальное внимание ситуации в Мьянме. Серьезным фактором дальнейшей деградации обстановки в этом государстве является политика дипломатическая и финансовая поддержка антиправительственных сил представителями коллективного Запада. Такого рода действия значительно осложняют перспективы восстановления общественно-политического спокойствия в стране. В этих условиях выступаем против использования многосторонних площадок, включая СПЧ, для давления на НИПИДы и осуждаем попытки западных стран политизировать мьянмарское досье. По-прежнему видим задачу мирового сообщества в том, чтобы способствовать урегулированию кризиса в Мьянме без вмешательства в ее внутренние дела. Однако практические шаги отдельных государств этим задачам слабо соответствуют. Вместо равноправного и содержательного диалога с НИПИДо предпочтение отдается санкциям и угрозам. Введенные в одностороннем порядке ограничительные меры наносят ущерб прежде всего обычным мьянманцам. На этом фоне отмечаем стремление АСЕАН содействовать поиску путей нормализации ситуации внутри и вокруг Мьянмы, в том числе решению гуманитарных проблем через предоставление помощи нуждающемуся населению. Призываем все заинтересованные государства продолжить дальнейшее налаживание диалога с властями этой страны при отказе от политизации правозащитной повестки. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank you. The floor now is for Malta. Malta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and thanks the High Commissioner for his update. Malta is profoundly concerned by reports of renewed violence and destruction in Rakhine State, resulting in the displacement of potentially tens of thousands of civilians, primarily Rohingya. We urge the Myanmar military and all armed groups to cease fighting, protect civilians, comply with international law, and immediately allow full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. This includes through implementing the binding order of the International Court of Justice for the protection of the Rohingya people. We call on Myanmar to cooperate fully with the IIM, allow unhindered access to investigate allegations and hold perpetrators accountable before impartial and independent courts. We fully support the ongoing work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar in this regard. The people of Myanmar deserve a future where children are safe from recruitment into armed groups, young persons can meaningfully participate in peace negotiations, and the military is accountable to civilians. To realize this, the international community must take action to end the violence and promote civilian rule, democracy and the rule of law in line with Security Council Resolution 2669 and ASEAN's 5-point consensus. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to Belarus.
Благодарю, господин председатель. Обеспокоены продолжающейся политизацией мандата СПЧ по Мьянме с учетом его реализации без согласия затрагиваемой страны. Отмечаем, что несмотря на предоставленную мьянмарскими властями информацию, она не была должным образом учтена, что ведет к искаженному восприятию реальной ситуации на местах. Считаем неприемлемым, когда в условиях лишения мьянмарской стороны голоса продолжается давление на страну с использованием односторонних механизмов. Вновь подчеркиваем необходимость учета позиции Мьянмы, приветствуем и призываем продолжать усилия по внутрирегиональному урегулированию конфликта. Призываем все другие заинтересованные страны и организации всячески способствовать усилиям правительства по нормализации ситуации и отказаться от дискредитировавшей себе практики давления и вмешательства в дела суверенных стран. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus thanks the High Commissioner for his update and aligns itself with the EU statement. The continued escalations of violence, along with the deterioration of the political, humanitarian and security situation in Myanmar following the 2021 military takeover, is aggravating an already dire situation on the ground, as just presented by the High Commissioner. In the context of the ongoing repression, women and children, especially in the Rohingya community, remain particularly vulnerable to the risk of sexual exploitation, trafficking, gender-based harassment and violence perpetrated by military as well as other armed groups. Deliberately provoked inter-ethnic tensions have ignited distrust and hatred within communities, further exacerbating human rights violations. Compliance with the ICJ's provisional measures and order, as well as the accountability efforts at the ICC, are imperative to end the violence. Cyprus calls for the safe, full and unhindered humanitarian access, especially to vulnerable communities, in line with international humanitarian law. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam. The floor now is for Malaysia.
Mr. President, while we witness the televised genocide of other crises, we should not turn a blind eye to the brutal killings of the Rohingyas. We strongly urge all parties to immediately cease violence, exercise utmost restraint, and uphold international humanitarian law, and to take all necessary measures to defuse tensions and ensure the protection and safety of all civilians. We call on all parties to take urgent steps to create a safe and conducive environment for the timely and safe delivery of humanitarian assistance to all those in need without discrimination. Malaysia appreciates the strong support by the international community with regard to the implementation of the ASEAN 5-point consensus. We would like to see real and meaningful progress in its implementation, especially by the Myanmar's military authorities. A conducive environment for political dialogue must be created to ensure that the democratic aspirations of the people are fulfilled. The people of Myanmar deserve an inclusive and durable solution to this crisis. Without it, we will witness further expansion of violence, which will hinder the safe, voluntary and dignified return of Rohingya refugees. As the largest host of Rohingya refugees in Southeast Asia, Malaysia continues to bear significant responsibilities, even as we are forced to stretch our limited resources beyond capacity. We recall the principle of proportionate burden and responsibility sharing in addressing the refugee crisis. Signatories of the 1951 Refugee Convention must live up to their obligations by providing equal resettlement pathways for Rohingya refugees to third countries. I thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. The floor now is for Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we thank the High Commissioner for his report and subsequent updates. It is worrisome that the latest reports clearly show continuously deteriorating human rights situation on the ground. This calls for an urgent and vital necessity for the cessation of hostilities and provision of humanitarian access to those in need. Georgia also shares concern over the recent escalation of violence, including in Rakhine State and Zagang region, which has resulted in increased death toll among civilians. These circumstances further trigger the forced displacement, and up to this point, continue to leave Rohingya refugees deprived of their ability to exercise the right of safe and dignified return to their homes. Georgia reiterates the necessity of prioritizing protection of civilians and reaffirms its support to the call of the High Commissioner for unhindered humanitarian access to the population of Myanmar, which is in dire need of life-saving assistance. Thank you.
I'm sorry. The floor now is for UK, United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your report. The conflict across Myanmar is escalating alarmingly, inflicting huge suffering on civilians and driving a devastating human rights and humanitarian crisis. Across Rakhine State, all communities are being targeted by ongoing airstrikes and shelling. The spread of disinformation is stoking intercommunal conflict and dividing communities. Recent attacks in Butidong and in Ban Puyu have fueled further displacement and caused the loss of innocent lives. The suffering of Rakhine communities, including the Rohingya, has been compounded by restrictions on humanitarian access. Food and medical supplies are urgently needed. The international community must consider all options for reaching those in Rakhine. Since 2017, the UK has provided over £45 million to the Rohingya and other Muslim minorities in Myanmar, and £391 million to Rohingya living in camps in Bangladesh. The current conditions in Rakhine State are not conducive to returns, which must be voluntary, safe and dignified. Accountability is crucial. We recall the provisional measures made by the International Court of Justice and continue to support evidence gathering, including by the IM. High Commissioner, what more can the Council do to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in Rakhine? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. The floor now is for Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for his report. The current levels of violence and suffering in Rakhine are unheard of since 2017. Reports of entire villages being bombed and burned down, corpses thrown in the streets, people extorted and abused are deeply disturbing. Both the Arakan army and the Myanmar military have reportedly increased their attacks on civilians in Rakhine, particularly the Rohingya. In the face of this violence, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced multiple times. Rohingya are once again trying to flee to neighboring Bangladesh for safety. We urge Bangladesh to keep its borders open for refugees. In the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, the Rohingya face an extremely dire human rights and humanitarian situation. We therefore encourage the High Commissioner and the country team to enhance their protection work in Cox's Bazar and to maintain a human rights focus in their work. Austria reiterates its call on the Myanmar military and all parties involved in the conflict in Myanmar to abide by the rules of international humanitarian and human rights law. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam. The floor now is for Ghana.
Mr. President, Ghana is deeply concerned about the tragic circumstances of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. It is regrettable that despite the strong urging by the international community, the authorities of Myanmar have not done enough to find lasting solutions to the complex and delicate issues affecting the welfare of Rohingya population and other minorities, including accelerating the implementation of initiatives to comprehensively address the rolling resentment, distrust, and hostility directed against them. Mr. President, there is simply no justification for any population or a group of people to be subjected to persistent displacement and denied the protection accorded to all persons. We therefore call for the reversal of all discriminatory policies and actions against the Rohingya Muslims and affirm our support for accountability measures to tackle the atrocities and serious violations of human rights, especially those committed against children, girls, and women. In closing, we emphasize that a credible and genuine approach needs to be found to facilitate the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of Rohingya refugees in order to assure a pathway to sustainable peace and long-lasting sustainable stability of Myanmar. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam. And now give the floor to Venezuela.
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela reconoce la complejidad de la situación en Myanmar. Alentamos a seguir apoyando los esfuerzos de buena fe en la búsqueda de la paz duradera y el desarrollo sostenible de su pueblo, con un enfoque no politizado, con estricto apego al derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, al respeto a la soberanía y la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los Estados. En ese sentido, consideramos que la aplicación de medidas coercitivas unilaterales y la imposición de mandatos no contribuyen en nada a solventar las necesidades del pueblo de Myanmar. Al contrario, estas acciones pueden generar mayores tensiones internas. Venezuela seguirá abogando por la vigencia de los derechos humanos de la población y alentando los esfuerzos por la paz y la reconciliación nacional en Myanmar, exhortando al diálogo político como vía esencial para solucionar las diferencias en el país. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Madam. The floor now is for Gambia. Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. President, the Gambia fully aligns with the OIC statement and thank the High Commissioner for his update on the human rights situation in Myanmar. We share the High Commissioner's concern about the catastrophic situation of human rights in Myanmar. We strongly condemned the military's systematic denial of the civilian population's basic human rights. Additionally, we share the High Commissioner's concern that the Rohingya people continue to subject to ruthless oppression. As this violates the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice, the Gambia will continue its pursuit of accountability for the ongoing genocidal acts against the Rohingya people and call for continued international support. We condemned all forms of human rights abuses against the Rohingya and other vulnerable populations, whether committed by the military or ethnic armed organizations. Mr. President, we ask what further actions can we take to support a peaceful transition to democracy in Myanmar while also protecting especially vulnerable populations and striving towards accountability for the ongoing perpetration of human rights abuses. And I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The floor now is for India.
Mr. President, we take note of the High Commissioner's report on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. We remain deeply concerned over the precarious humanitarian and security situation in Myanmar. As an immediate neighbor and a friend of the people of Myanmar, India has been repeatedly calling for immediate cessation of violence by all sides, release of political detainees, humanitarian assistance, and the resolution of the crisis through constructive dialogue. We reiterate the need to arrive at peaceful solutions that are Myanmar-led and Myanmar-owned. Increased influx of people from Myanmar into our northeastern states and the challenge of transnational crimes such as drug and human trafficking continue to be areas of grave concern. We've always accorded priority to the peace, stability and development of Myanmar and have been making consistent efforts towards these objectives in the form of humanitarian assistance, people-centric projects and building capacities in democratic systems and practices, including in the areas of constitutionalism and federalism in Myanmar. India remains steadfast in its support of Myanmar's transition towards inclusive federal democracy. Mr. President, we support the ASEAN-led efforts and the ASEAN 5-point consensus and continue to closely coordinate our policy with ASEAN in this regard. We continue to support the efforts of UN Secretary General in political resolution of the current situation in Myanmar. Thank you.
Malawi, you have the floor. Apparently Malawi. Oh, sorry. Please,
Thank you,
Malawi,
Mr. President. Malawi thanks the High Commissioner for the report, and we are deeply concerned about the deteriorated situation in Myanmar, especially the indiscriminate attacks on civilians, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and targeting of religious sites and personnel. Malawi is also troubled by the continued violence and grave human rights violations against the Rohingya and other minority communities, which appear to be inconsistent with the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. Accountability for these crimes is essential. Malawi urges the international community to take urgent and effective action to protect the Rohingya and other minorities and ensure that the Myanmar military respects its obligations under international law. Malawi further urges the international community to act with unity and determination to hold perpetrators accountable and support the people of Myanmar in their quest for democracy, human rights, and sustainable peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And now the floor is for Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand appreciates the High Commissioner for his report. Thailand remains deeply concerned over the escalation of violence in many parts of Myanmar, which has led to even more forced displacement and complicating the already difficult humanitarian situation and aid delivery in the country. On the 25th of March this year, Thailand delivered humanitarian assistance to approximately 20,000 internally displaced persons in Kayin State. It was the first cross-border humanitarian assistance into Myanmar, carried out by the Thai and Myanmar Red Cross societies under the observation of the AHA Center. Thailand is considering ways and means to conduct the next phase of humanitarian assistance as a step to implement the ASEAN's 5-point consensus. We organize meetings with the international organizations, academia, and civil society to exchange views on how to scale up, diversify, and engage more with relevant local partners. We hope that the international community will continue to support efforts to alleviate suffering and promote human rights of Myanmar people, and also to support ASEAN efforts to foster a peaceful political solution in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. The floor now is for Vietnam.
Mr. President, we take note of the High Commissioner's report on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. We emphasize that the process of addressing the situation in Myanmar must be owned and led by the country itself, in line with the will and interests of the people of Myanmar. This is to ensure the fundamental principles of non-interference in the international affairs of the country and respect for its sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and unity. Relevant parties in Myanmar should work in good faith with ASEAN and to fully and effectively implement the 5-point consensus so as to end violence, create a conducive environment for inclusive dialogue and reconciliation, while ensuring humanitarian and healthcare access for all without any discrimination. Vietnam commends and encourages the closer cooperation between ASEAN and the UN in assisting Myanmar to seek a workable and endurable solution to its existing issue, including the collaboration between their respective special envoys on the Myanmar issue and between the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management and the UN agencies in humanitarian aid. Vietnam calls for greater efforts in addressing the root causes of the refugee situation in Rakhine State.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your declaration. I now give the floor to the Lao PDR. Sorry, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Lao PDR reaffirmed that restoring peace and stability is a necessary condition for the promotion and protection of human rights in Myanmar. We call all parties to prioritize peace and stability and create conducive conditions for a conclusive national dialogue and safe delivery of humanitarian assistance without discrimination. The LAOPDR supports ASEAN's role in facilitating Myanmar to have a comprehensive and durable solution through the implementation of the ASEAN 5-point consensus. In this regard, the LAOPDR's ASEAN Chair Special Envoy on Myanmar has actively engaged with various Myanmar stakeholders to move forward dialogue and peaceful solution. We reiterate that the promotion of human rights shall be based on genuine dialogue and cooperation and guided by the principle of impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and non-politicization. I thank you.
I thank you, sir. We now will move to the list of speakers on behalf of the National Human Rights Institution and the NGOs, and I begin by giving the floor to the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Mr. President, we welcome the report of High Commissioner. This debate takes place in a context where Rohingyas are again confronting the dire prospects of genocides and crimes against humanity. Rohingya villages have been forcefully evacuated by the Arakan army in its escalating war against the Myanmar military. Last month alone, more than 200,000 Rohingya have been forcibly displaced from the villages under the control of the Arakan army. At least 1,500 Rohingya have been killed by the Arakan army since March. Rohingya have been subjected to forced conscription by both military and Arakan army. As the High Commissioner report suggests, the current movement in Myanmar offers a vision towards a post-coup unified federal democratic Myanmar. However, without urgent international action to hold the military and Arakan army accountable, Rohingya will not have a place in that future. The rhetoric and actions of the Arakan army, which controls majority of Rohingya homeland in Rakhine state, clearly demonstrate that they do not consider the Rohingya as part of Myanmar's future. Once again, the Rohingyas are subjected to the same hateful, discriminatory narratives and incitement. Peaceful and democratic Myanmar requires equal recognition of the ethnic nationality status of the Rohingya, as well as justice and accountability for the continuing genocide against Rohingya and other atrocities in the country through international mechanism, the ICC. We further urge UN President Nia Mount Township to take urgent measures to deter.
Thank you. Now the floor is for. Thank you. The floor is for Civicus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Civicus and the Burma Human Rights Network thank the High Commissioner for his report and remain concerned about the state of civil space and the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. The report reflects our ongoing concerns about the closure of civil space by the junta and thousands of political prisoners, including human rights defenders, that remain in detention on fabricated charges. Many face torture and degraded treatment, and at least 1,700 have died in custody in a climate of complete impunity. We are also concerned about indiscriminate attacks against civilians with weapons supplied by a number of countries, the impact of the conscription law. Your report also notes that in addition to persistent discrimination, members of the Rohingya community experience new violence and violations since the resumption of hostility in Rakhine in November. ASEAN has continued to fail to address the crisis in Myanmar, and it's time for the international community to do more. We welcome your recommendations calling for the release of all political prisoners. There must also be an end to all violence and attacks directed against civilians, including the Rohingya. We urge member states to ensure all existing obstacles to humanitarian access are removed, including in Rakhine state, and to support all accountability efforts. We ask the High Commissioner, what should the Council do to adequately and promptly hold the assault on civic space and serious human rights violations committed by the junta and other armed groups, and to push ASEAN to end its inaction on Myanmar. We thank you.
I thank you, Madame. I now give the floor for the Centre pour les droits civils et politiques.
The Center for Civil and Political Rights welcomes the report of the High Commissioner. However, this report is another evidence of the atrocity of the Myanmar military, catastrophic situation created by it, and grave violation of international human rights and humanitarian law, primarily committed by the junta and its affiliates, but also by other actors involved in the conflict, including abuses and discriminations against Rohingyas. The rule of law and domestic justice system are collapsed. Political prisoners are tried in prison courts where the public access is severely limited. Judges are forced to give maximum prison sentences through pro forma process, which completely disregard fair trial rights. Torture and sexual violence are rampant in detention. The enforcement of the conscription law has added another dimension to the risk faced by civilians, especially the youth among vulnerable groups, including Rohingyas. Mr. High Commissioner, the junta has been ignoring the calls from the international community, including Security Council resolution and ASEAN 5-point consensus. What should be done to ensure your recommendations addressed to it are properly implemented? What concrete action should be taken by the international community to assist and strengthen the local governance systems as identified in your report? Moreover, what concrete steps can you suggest to the NUG in order for it to ratify and implement the ICCPR and CAT, and to effectively engage with the UN mechanism, in particular concerning the challenge of its recognition by the UN Credential Committee? I thank you.
Thank you, Madam. The floor now is for Association Mauna for Human Rights and Immigration.
Thank you. We thank the High Commissioner for his report. Ever since the coup in 2021, grave violations of human rights have increased against the Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. The escalation of hostilities between the state military and the Arakan army has intensified the humanitarian crisis. Forced recruitment into the military, along with indiscriminate attacks by ground, sea, and air, have resulted in the death of hundreds of civilians. This is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. As highlighted in the High Commissioner's report, nearly 2.8 million people have been displaced, both within Myanmar and across neighboring countries. Among religious and ethnic minorities impacted by the conflict, the situation of the Rohingya, who have already suffered discrimination and human rights violation for decades, is worsening as they are now targeted by both parties. Association Mauna and Geneva International Center for Justice call on the international community to increase humanitarian aid for all affected, including refugees in neighboring countries. Rohingya must be granted citizenship, full rights, and assured a safe return to their homeland. Finally, we support the High Commissioner's call to refer the current situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court by the Security Council, with the goal of holding military leaders accountable for committing war crimes. Without accountability, there can be no lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank you. The floor now is for Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada by video.
Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada and the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute deplore the catastrophic deterioration of human rights in Myanmar due to the military junta's systematic commission of atrocities against civilians. Over 3 years into the military coup, the junta has increased attacks on displaced and conflict-affected ethnic and minority populations and on human rights defenders and activists. Mass displacement continues at an alarming rate, with over 2.8 million internally displaced in Myanmar since the coup and nearly 19 million in humanitarian need. Thousands of Rohingya are fleeing from their homes and are increasingly unsafe, only a few years after a military campaign of genocide against them. They are now facing atrocities by the junta and the Arakan army. The primary cause of violations is unchecked impunity of Myanmar's military and laws that violate international law, implemented by courts with no independence. More than 20,500 are unlawfully detained, including over 160 sentenced to death. Torture, ill-treatment, and extrajudicial killings are routine, along with denial of adequate legal representation and fair trials. Lawyers face restrictions, threats, prosecution, and arbitrary detention when trying to represent political detainees in unfair closed proceedings. We call on all council members, observer states, and UN bodies to engage with the National Unity Government, ethnic resistance organizations, and broader civil society to strengthen local governance systems, seize engagement with the junta and stop the flow of weapons, and facilitate the immediate delivery of humanitarian assistance to displaced and vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. The floor now is for Human Rights Watch.
In Myanmar, Bangladesh and across the region, the Rohingya are denied safety and dignity, trapped in cycles of violence and repression while they continue waiting for justice and freedom. In Rakhine State, about 630,000 Rohingya are caught in the crosshairs as Myanmar's junta and the Arakan army battle for control. More than 200,000 civilians have been displaced since the fighting resumed last November. Rohingya villages that were devastated by military atrocities in 2017 are again being targeted in widespread arson attacks. Over the past 7 months, the junta has carried out more than 880 airstrikes. 1/5 of them took place in Rakhine State. Since February, Myanmar security forces have forcibly conscripted 5,000 Rohingya men and boys from across Rakhine and with the support of armed groups from the camps in Bangladesh. Thus, Rohingya who have been denied citizenship and basic freedoms under the military system of apartheid are being forced unlawfully to fight on the junta's behalf. To forcibly return Rohingya refugees to Myanmar amid the ongoing fighting and repression would threaten their lives and risk persecution. Until Rohingya can safely return home, donors should provide funding to meet the needs of the 1 million refugees in Bangladesh and expand resettlement opportunities. Bangladesh should lift restrictions on work, movement and education to ensure refugees have the tools to rebuild their lives. Building durable solutions for the Rohingya and upholding the rights of all people in Myanmar depends on the establishment of a civilian democratic rule, holding the military accountable for its crimes. Thank you.
The floor now is for Association Caritative Étudiante pour la Jeunesse. Je vous remercie.
Commissioner, however, we deeply deplore that a number of countries, including those sitting here as members of this very council, remain silent and inactive. And more regrettably, there are even countries and private actors providing the junta with weapons, resources and revenues. It is against this backdrop that, despite repeated reports and mounting evidence over the catastrophic situation in Myanmar, the Myanmar military is still able to commit atrocity and blatant violation of human rights and humanitarian law with the total impunity, whereby completely ignoring the calls from various international and regional bodies. More than 4 years after the coup, the junta continues to target pro-democracy activists, human rights defenders, including lawyers and journalists, and civil society, shrinking civic and political space. For the last 20 years, the world continued to be witness of ongoing many genocides and forced occupation of populations, like in Sri Lanka, where more than 175 Indian Tamils were killed or are unaccounted. And 15 years after, there is no any justice process. In Palestine, where more than 37,000 Palestinians were killed, over 100,000 were injured for just 8 last months. Mr. President, the United Nations member countries have to find a way to save those innocent people and victims, and need to take a powerful international justice mechanism. Mr. High Commissioner, how many updates, reports and calls need to be made? How many people must die and suffer in order for the international community to take stronger and coordinated and decisive action to end this crisis and to save millions of people in Myanmar? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now, the last speaker would be Legal Action Worldwide.
Mr. President, distinguished representatives, we thank the High Commissioner for his report. We are deeply alarmed by the ongoing human rights crisis affecting the Rohingya both in Rakhine State, Myanmar, and in refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. In Rakhine State, fighting between the Myanmar military, the Arakan army, and Rohingya armed groups has escalated to a shocking level. Facing mounting losses, the military has resorted to forcibly conscripting and coercing Rohingya to fight against the Arakan army and to act as human shields, putting Rohingya communities at further risk of further reprisals from civilian and armed actors alike. Thousands of Rohingya are now caught in the middle of ongoing hostilities and are displaced as their villages are destroyed. This crisis extends to the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, where nearly 1 million Rohingya face routine abduction and extortion by armed groups. Legal Action Worldwide has received first-hand reports indicating that simply leaving your shelter puts Rohingya men and boys at risk of forced recruitment. While no ethnic peoples have been unaffected by the ongoing fighting, we are deeply concerned with the military's systematic campaign to fuel ethnic tensions that leave the Rohingya more vulnerable to intercommunal violence. Propaganda and misinformation directed against the Rohingya is rampant and reminiscent of the vicious narratives used to incite horrific violence against the Rohingya in 2012 and 2017. High Commissioner, what specific steps can Member States take to ensure protection for Rohingya civilians, both in Rakhine State and refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, and what specific actions is your office undertaking to pursue accountability? Thank you.
I thank you. As announced, that was the last speaker on my list for this dialogue. I now give you back the floor, Mr. High Commissioner, for your interaction with the Council and its membership, and also for your concluding remarks. You have the floor, sir.
Merci beaucoup, and thank you all very much for contributing to this interactive dialogue. I took good note of the fact that it was indeed a cross-regional response, and that is indeed very important, because we need to make sure that the message is loud and clear to the military in Myanmar that the world is watching, and action needs to be taken. And if one just looks at the statistics, horrific statistics, it makes it abundantly clear that this is an issue that has not only domestic implications for the people of Myanmar, but also already regional implications and global implications. The violence that affects, out of 333 townships, 255. So 255 townships out of 330 are currently affected by violence since the military coup in February 21. We have over 18 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. I already mentioned the 3 million people internally displaced. We have 15.2 million people facing acute food insecurity, and we have an estimated 25 million people living under the poverty line. We have over 1 million refugees, Rohingya refugees from Myanmar in Bangladesh, a couple of 100,000 in Malaysia and elsewhere. So anyone who would say that this is a matter of domestic concern is certainly proven wrong by the very statistics that I have just mentioned, but also by the result of the impact that the crisis had on neighboring countries and beyond. There is I think one delegation mentioned this in particular, there's a specific gender dimension to it. The gender impact of the coup has been tremendous. It continues to worsen. At least 185 girls and 841 women have been killed by the military since the coup. 5,536 have been arrested. These are our statistics. It may mean that there is only the tip of the iceberg. Of the 167 individuals that were sentenced to death by military-controlled courts that deny any guarantee, 16 are women. Sexual violence is reported as rampant, although fears and shame prevent a proper quantification of these crimes. And when it comes to the internally displaced, half of them, 1.5 million, are women, and of the displaced population are women and girls. They have no or only limited access to education and health, and in several parts of the country to shelter and food. Recent reports of the initiation of forced conscription by the military involves also women under the military law, which obviously exacerbates all these existing concerns. It is absolutely clear that humanitarian response as a whole has to be stepped up, and where we need much more creativity in the way that this humanitarian assistance actually gets delivered. It has to involve a lot more of the local possibilities, and most certainly avoid any military channels. So all the non-military channels have to be increased massively so that important humanitarian assistance can go into the country. And I think we really need more creativity about cross-border assistance as well. I mean, the Thai delegation mentioned the initiative on their border. The ASEAN support absolutely needs to be built up, but also the UN and ASEAN humanitarian assistance needs to be particularly strengthened. We know that this is going to be particularly challenging in Rakhine State, as neither the military nor the Arakan army will protect Rohingya. So I have to say, when it comes to Rakhine State, this is incredibly challenging, and we need to make sure that all arbitrary denial of humanitarian access and humanitarian assistance are properly documented, so they are part of the accountability framework that needs to be part of all accountability efforts in that regard. There was also a question about the flow of dual-use goods and jet fuel. And as you remember, I have reportedly mentioned to this Council that the impact of airstrikes on the civilian population is atrocious. It gives the military a position of weapon superiority, and just to look at statistics, between 1 August 23 and 31 March 24, airstrikes have claimed at least 362 civilian victims, marking a 63% increase from the previous 230 fatalities. Limiting access to jet fuel and dual-use equipment is absolutely critical to ensure protection of civilians and prevent the military to continue perpetrating violations. I've also mentioned in my oral update, but also in the report, the emergence of governance structures at the local level that have started to fill the gap to promote the rights of people through the provision of essential services. They need to be supported and encouraged. There needs to be, again, more creativity about multiple funding models. We have seen participatory models emerge, in particularly, as I mentioned, in Kaya State, that in fact there are capacities at the local level to forge, in a way, a new Myanmar society that I have been talking about. Women's leadership has played a very important role in that regard. So I really call on all states to increase engagement with the NUG, with the local governance structures, but also with all the civil society organizations and the human rights defenders that are inside and outside of Myanmar, and to engage in this visioning exercise that I have mentioned also in the past. Accountability is absolutely critical. There's no doubt about this, and both the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, as well as the International Criminal Court processes are vitally important, and I commend the Gambia in this regard. I urge all states to cooperate more with the IIMM, the International Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, so that they can access new evidence, but also new sources of information. And as I have said in the past, it is time for the Security Council to broaden the referral of the whole situation to the International Criminal Court. We know that ultimately, to get out of this current crisis, Myanmar will need a comprehensive transitional justice process to achieve reconciliation and also more social cohesion. I also wanted to mention particular social media platforms, because what we see, especially in Rakhine State, but also in other parts of Myanmar, is the fueling of hate speech, dehumanizing language, especially between the two communities in Rakhine and Rohingya in Rakhine State. I think more efforts have to go into ensuring that this hate speech is not becoming viral on social media platforms. I know from my own experience when I was in 2015 in northern Rakhine State in Mongdao, it was actually during Ramadan, and I was able to break fast between both communities, the Rohingya and the Rakhine communities. It was still possible to do that. So there is indeed the possibility for social cohesion. Unfortunately, because of the divide and rule type of approach, but also because of social media, we have seen a deterioration when it comes to the intercommunal cohesion. But it is possible to reconstruct it. I have never, and this goes back to my mission that I've just undertaken to Southeast Asia, it was really encouraging to see when you actually meet with the refugee communities, it was possible to meet with all of the representatives. In the past, I could only meet with them separately. That actually shows that there is something emerging within the society that gives us hope for the future. But we really need to invest in these local grassroots level organizations and build and forge something that is possible for the future. And I just wanted to mention this at the end, because this mission to Southeast Asia was very much important, and it was precisely to put the spotlight on Myanmar and to ensure that we give it the intention and the political weight that it requires, because beyond ASEAN, ASEAN will need to be supported, but beyond ASEAN, there needs to be a stepping up of international support by the international community as a whole in order to respond to this very, very deeply worrying and troubling situation that we see emerge in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. High Commissioner, for your important interaction with all those who participated to this interactive dialogue, the membership and other stakeholders, particularly the National Human Rights Institution and NGOs. Excellencies, this brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish again to thank the High Commissioner for his participation and for his exchanges with all of us. We will now take a short break of no more than 2 minutes before inaugurating our enhanced interactive dialogue on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. No more than 2 minutes, please. And by the way, we have secured the possibility to stay in room and advancing in our work till 1:15 p.m. Thank you again for the interpreters for their very strong, helpful and support for the activities of the Council.
Good.
Ambassador.
Hello, good morning.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, we will now begin, as announced, the enhanced interactive dialogue on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, pursuant to Council Resolution 54/1. Exceptionally, interpretation into Dari will be available this meeting. To make it accessible to those following this interactive dialogue in Afghanistan, the interpretation is available on channel number 8. It is my honor to welcome Mrs. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will deliver the opening statements. Let me also welcome our distinguished presenters, Mr. Richard Bennett, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, Her Excellency Mr. Nazir Ahmed Andisha, Permanent Representative of Afghanistan to the United Nations Office in Geneva, Mrs. Ben Hafsa Yaqoubi, woman and disability rights activist, Mrs. Shafiqa Kpalwak, poet, writer, and human rights activist, Mrs. Lina Tori Yan, woman, peace and security advocate, and finally, Mrs. Leila, a young girl from inside Afghanistan by video message. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now have the honor to give you the floor, Your Excellency, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, for your statement in presentation of this interactive dialogue. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends. I'm pleased to present the High Commissioner's talking points to represent him at this enhanced interactive dialogue on the situation of human rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. And let me start by extending a particular welcome of solidarity to the courageous Afghan women who are participating with us today and to those joining us from Afghanistan and from around the world. It is critical to ensure that your voices remain at the center of this Council's discussion and across all other international fora. The grave scale of abuses in Afghanistan requires sustained international attention to the plight of Afghan women and real support for their cause. Our office has sought to enable this Council to hear directly a diversity of voices of Afghan women from inside and outside Afghanistan, their views, their lived experiences, the concerns they have, the difficulties they face, and their determination to face the future. This dialogue will focus on the phenomenon of an institutionalized system of discrimination, segregation, disrespect for human dignity, and the exclusion of women and girls in Afghanistan. In particular, it will address the ongoing impact of Taliban policies on women's and girls' enjoyment of fundamental freedoms and rights. This assault on women continues to affect and limit all their rights, including the right to education, the right to work, and to access effective remedies for injustice, violence, and discrimination. This enhanced dialogue builds upon the dialogue that we held a year ago with the Special Rapporteur and the Working Group on discrimination against women and girls. Since then, regrettably, the situation has worsened. Restrictions on all rights have tightened. Women are now essentially confined to their homes. Although the de facto authorities continue to claim that women's rights will be protected within the framework of Sharia law, over the past year, further and more intrusive restrictions have indeed been applied to women's and girls' lives. The cumulative effect of these various edicts has removed women and girls from public life, confining them to their homes, denying their fundamental rights and freedoms, their individual autonomy, and the most basic opportunities of life. Afghanistan remains the only country in the world, the only country, where girls are denied education beyond primary level. A few days ago, we hit the grim milestone of 1,000 days of Afghan girls being denied this fundamental enabling right. Through this ban, the Taliban continue to restrict girls' development opportunities and their ability to live independently in the future, further corroding, undermining the rich and diverse fabric of Afghan society. The Taliban also continue to apply their ban on women from working for international organizations, including the United Nations, as well as outside the home in many sectors. Its manifest illegality under international law aside, this measure significantly impacts the ability of the United Nations and other organizations to provide critical services to the population experiencing chronic poverty and humanitarian need. Just last week, the de facto authorities cut female civil servants' pay compared to male employees. The removal of women from public service further impacts their ability to be seen, to be heard, and to participate in the decision-making processes that directly affect their lives. Ongoing restrictions on movement, including the requirement of a mahram or male chaperone to travel further than a small radius from their homes, leaves them with limited and at times no ability to undertake social, cultural or economic activities outside of their homes. Restrictions on places where they may socialize have also been imposed. Our office welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, which highlights this systematic and all-encompassing set of restrictions that women and girls continue to face. It focuses on intersectional forms of repression and oppression and the realities of what Afghan women of all ages face, as well as, for example, women living with disabilities and minorities. We remain deeply concerned at this ongoing discriminatory and restrictive environment, as well as its consequences. This has had enormous impact on women and girls' mental health, for example, reflected in the shocking increase in suicides over the past year. There remains little accountability for violence against women and girls or for other violations of their rights, as the de facto justice system continues to be neither gender responsive nor accessible to women. Such systematic, extreme discrimination and violence must not be normalized nor be tolerated by the international community. I hope that today's dialogue will lead to a consolidation of our agreement on the need for concerted action by this Council and the wider international community. The brave women activists present today should feel that the international community stands with them and is committed to find ways to influence the de facto authorities to reverse their regressive and repressive edicts. The future potential of Afghanistan can only be realized through upholding the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights by all women and girls. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mrs. Deputy High Commissioner, for your important statement. I then now will give the floor to our speakers as introductory for this interactive dialogue. And I now give you the floor, Mr. Bennett, for your presentation. Mr. Special Rapporteur, you have the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, fellow panelists, Afghan friends, members of civil society, Eid Mubarak to Afghans and others who celebrate. I'm pleased to present my new report, as requested by this Council at its 54th session. I'm also honoured to be joined by 3 Afghan human rights defenders. A longer version of this statement will be posted online. My new report builds on and deepens the findings of my joint report with the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls on the Taliban's discriminatory and misogynistic policies. Following extensive research, consultation and analysis, it finds that the Taliban's institutionalized system of gender oppression, established and enforced through its violations of women and girls' fundamental rights, is widespread and systematic, and appears to constitute an attack on the entire civilian population, amounting to crimes against humanity. This attack is intensifying. The Taliban system of discrimination, segregation, disrespect for human dignity and exclusion is pervasive, methodical, and imposed through edicts, policies and enforcement, sanctioning severe deprivations of fundamental rights, each systematically interacting with others, creating a mutually reinforcing architecture of oppression. Since last June, the de facto authorities have issued at least 52 edicts that intensify restrictions on Afghan women and girls, which are increasingly enforced, sometimes violently. The institutionalized deprivation causes profound gendered harm, spreading across Afghan society and cascading down through generations. Women and girls excluded from the education system faced heightened risks of forced marriage and debt bondage. Day by day, Afghanistan is being deprived of its future women engineers, journalists, biologists, politicians and poets, to name a few. Systematic restrictions of women's right to work and freedom of movement has robbed them of their financial autonomy, forcing dependence on male relatives. Families have plunged deeper into poverty, with increased reports of depression and suicide among women and girls. Against this backdrop, I admire the ingenuity and determination of Afghan women who continue to find ways to sustain themselves and their families. Afghans with intersecting marginalized identities, including people with disabilities, LGBTIQ persons and those from ethnic, religious and linguistic and other minorities face heightened discrimination and violence. I ask the Council to consider the impact on Afghanistan's children. What will be the effect on all Afghans, but particularly on girls and boys, of the erasure of strong female role models outside of the home? What conception of the world and of themselves do girls have when they have no memories of women thriving independently from men? And what type of men do boys raised within an institutionalized regime which has systematically disempowered women and girls grow into? Mr. President, the violations against women and girls in Afghanistan are so severe and extensive, I have concluded that they may amount to crimes against humanity, including gender persecution. In my consultations with Afghan survivors, particularly women, they emphasize that the term gender apartheid most accurately describes their experience and are calling for its recognition as a crime against humanity. I also consider that this system of domination and oppression of women and girls should propel discussion on codification of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity and as a human rights violation, defined in a gender-inclusive way. We must ensure that all victims and survivors can access justice for the totality of crimes committed against them. The gravity and scale of the crimes can't be overstated. We have a collective responsibility to challenge and dismantle this appalling system and to hold those responsible to account. No single approach is likely to be effective on its own. What we need is an all-tools approach centred around 4 key pillars: justice and accountability, incorporating human rights and women's voices in political processes and diplomatic engagement, bolstering documentation and reinforcing protection and solidarity for Afghan women, girls and human rights defenders. In 12 days' time, a major meeting will take place in Doha. This offers an important opportunity to affirm that the rights and voices of women and girls will not be sidelined. I reiterate the importance of ensuring that civil society, including women, are meaningful participants in the meeting and that women's rights are central to discussions. For the credibility and sustainability of international engagement, it's vital that it is underpinned by principled human rights-centered approach. The Taliban are not recognized as a government and should not be treated as such. They must not be allowed to dictate the terms of UN-hosted meetings. Meaningful and sustained improvements in human rights must form a central part of any way forward for Afghanistan. Failure to learn the lessons of the past and sideline human rights could have devastating and long-lasting consequences. Mr. President, the Taliban's institutionalization of its system of gender oppression should shock the conscience of humanity. It's incumbent upon us all to take decisive action, to stand with Afghan women and girls, hold the perpetrators accountable, and restore dignity, equality, and justice for all. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Special Rapporteur, for your insight and highlights on the situation of Afghanistan as presented by you under your own mandate. I now give you the floor, Excellency Nasser Ahmed Andisha, Ambassador of Afghanistan and PR, for your presentation. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Shukran, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome the latest report by the Special Rapporteur on the phenomena of an institutionalized system of discrimination, segregation, disrespect for human dignity, and exclusion of women and girls under the Taliban. As credible reports and eyewitness testimonies indicates, Afghanistan is falling into a state of darkness and repression, marked by severe and systemic violation of fundamental human rights, institutionalized discrimination and exclusion, along with instances of torture, degrading and inhumane treatment are prevailing. No doubt, Afghanistan under the Taliban rule faces one of the most serious institutionalized human rights crises in the world, particularly for women and girls, and it's increasingly worsening. Mr. President, Excellencies, let me draw your attention to something very serious. The ongoing entrenchment of Taliban gender oppression and domination, as indicated in this report, and the inherent dehumanization of women and girls is likely sowing a dangerous ideology in the new generation of Afghan, particularly young men and boys. This could potentially lead to future security risks in the region and beyond. The current impunity which may be perceived as tolerance of the domination and abuse of women and girls, is creating risks that are not being fully recognized, acknowledged, or addressed. Mr. President, as member of the United Nations, Afghanistan has obligations under the UN Charter, international treaties and resolutions, including but not limited to CEDAW, the ILO Convention, the Security Council Resolution 1325. These treaties and resolutions mandate elimination of discrimination against women, promote gender equality in the workplace, and ensure women participation in peace and security processes. However, the Taliban rhetoric and action starkly contravene these obligations, demonstrating institutionalized discrimination and inclusion of women and girls. Approximately 52 edicts issued between June 2023 and March 2024 shows that the further restriction for women and girls across the country. Mr. President, the UN Charter unequivocally reaffirms the equal rights of men and women. Article 4 emphasizes that peace-loving states accepting the obligation contained in the present charter are able and willing to carry them out will get a seat around the table. In the past 3 years, the Taliban government has proven that it is neither willing nor able or capable of carrying these basic UN Charter obligations. Therefore, the people of Afghanistan appeals to this Council member to uphold the core values of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognizing Afghanistan's role as one of its original signatories. They call for a steadfast commitment on the principle of universality, indivisibility and interrelatedness of UDHR in all discussions and decisions related to Afghanistan. The UN should prioritize the protection of fundamental human rights under the Taliban rule. They emphasize, the people of Afghanistan, that women's basic rights should be recognized as essential and non-negotiable, rather than a means to serve other interests and ends. The protection and the empowerment of women are paramount for ensuring just and equitable Afghanistan, for Afghanistan of future and Afghanistan after Taliban. This report highlights that the UN member states have heightened obligation to address severe breaches of fundamental human rights in the current context. They must avoid normalizing or legitimizing the Taliban under any guise, including during the upcoming Doha meeting on the 28th of June this month. Mr. President, impunity must not find refuge anywhere, not in Afghanistan, not in Palestine, not in Ukraine or elsewhere. This Council should heed to calls for more robust accountability mechanism to ensure justice is served. Mr. President, this report once again shows that the worsening of unprecedented situation of human rights in Afghanistan demands full accountability. Special procedures, mandate holders and the treaty bodies are urged to monitor and coordinate efforts closely. States engaged with the Taliban must demand human rights respect and include women in their dialogues. Finally, Mr. President, I emphasize that the gender apartheid should be recognized as a crime against humanity, and we call for an independent investigative mechanism by this Council that reflects the gravity of the situation in Afghanistan. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your presentation. I now give the floor via video to Ms. Leila for her presentation. Could we launch the video message of Ms. Leila?
Abandoning schools and universities, I could not continue my education, but I tried to learn new skills. I faced so many challenges, not only me, but also my other women in my country. They cannot study, so they will not have a job. Even I couldn't graduate from school because the ban came. And because of that, I lost many opportunities in my life. I want to be an effective person, a successful person. Afghan girls are like those birds that with broken wings, they are still trying to fly. And they still want to find an opportunity and fly as high as they can. And nowadays that I am at home with no activity, with no communicating with people, I face to depression and I'm really helpless and I am losing my hope. We all, Afghan girls, we all lose our freedom and we are not like the past. We cannot do activities that we did in the past. And all these things changed in our life. At the past, girls could travel alone without anyone. They were free, but now we are not free. We are like slaves. We should always have man with ourselves. And without mahram, we are not allowed to travel anywhere. I don't feel safe because if I don't obey those rules, I'm really afraid that what will happen to me. I'm really worried about my future. Do they capture me? Do they kill me? Or what? I really feel sad and I say that why these things happen to us, only to Afghan girls. Nobody is facing these challenges that everyday girls. But despite of all restrictions, I still try to deal with problems and survive from this situation. So no power, no injustice is forever. I always try to keep my friends and my family, especially my sisters, hopeful. I didn't give up, and I will not, and I will never give up, and I will never let them to give up. Nowadays, I have very simple activities. I'm helping with my mom in cooking. I learned to cook new foods and these things, but it is not my future. I want to have a bright future. I want to become a leader. I want to become voice of all Afghan girls. And I want help with Afghan girls. I want to be successful, and I want to make my parents proud. My community before was supportive to the normal activities the girls do. After changing the regime, their minds and the way of their thinking also changed. I mean the girls. At the past, they thought that they should be successful, they should be a leader, they should make their parents proud. But now they cannot. You know, a few months ago, they captured girls and they badly hated them, and they I don't know what other bad actions they what done by them. Those girls that they didn't wear proper hijab, I'm sure that it's an excuse because girls really afraid. They always try to wear black scarf, black coat, everything. And 3 or 4 of those girls or ladies, when they come back, they did suicide. And when a person wants to do suicide, when there is no hope in human beings' life, at the time they choose this option to do suicide. Most of my friends nowadays, they got married, they become mother, and they have a baby. And so most of the ladies have lost their hopes of studying, and they choose to do early marriage. If I get married soon, at that time, I'm sure that in the future, I will be a weak mother, and my children will not be proud of me. My children will be the same of me, weak, hopeless, and they cannot deal with problems. Despite of all challenges, my parents are great supporters in my life. I really want to become a leader, and I want to be the voice of all Afghan girls and all over the world. And I wish I could help them and motivate them. The young girls of Afghanistan are what keeps me hopeful. Some of them are like me. They try to deal with problems, and they don't want to give up, and they still want to have hope, and they don't want to give up. And these things are what keeps me hopeful. I appeal to the international community. Actually, I beg them to keep supporting the girls and women of Afghanistan, especially in education and work. I hope we could go back to school and be able to get jobs. Always remember, on the road to success, there always we. I mean we, not only all women in Afghanistan, but the whole Afghanistan and international community. And I'm so grateful to international community to support Afghan girls in this situation. And I wish that they could support us more and more.
I thank you, Mrs. Leila, for your important and courageous testimony. I now give the floor to you, Mrs. Ben Hafsa Yaqoubi, for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Mr. Richard Bennett and his vulnerable team for creating this valuable report. So today I am here to speak with you regarding the women and girls from my homeland, regarding the people who always have experience of the gender discrimination and gender persecution in their life. Yes, Their Excellencies, I know the texture of traditional and patriarchy of our society, but within past 20 years, leading up 2021, at least we had some support of international society and we had our local constitution. Based on 2004 Afghanistan constitution and based on the convention of the CEDAW and convention of the rights of people with disability, at least we could pursue to our education rights. We had the chance to pursue to some of our rights. We could walk without the fear of getting detected or going to detention center or being tortured within the then government. But unfortunately, after Taliban's second takeover, Afghanistan got like a dark place and a vast prison for all Afghanistan people, specifically women and girls. Yes, we women and girls are experiencing like systematic gender apartheid within these 3 years. We are suffering from this gender apartheid. And you imagine being a woman, being a girl, being with disability, living in a rural area and having other problems as well. I'm trying to draw your attention to a woman life which who I named her Amina. Amina has 5 daughters. One of them has physical impairment, and then she had her own job, but nowadays she doesn't have any job. She's at home, and the thing that she is worried about it, she told me that she wanted to at least have one day without worry regarding her daughters, not to be obliged to go to forced marriage just because of their poverty and because of their disability. Ladies and gentlemen, I just must to acknowledge, based on the high technology and based on the lots of immigration which is happening, the extremism and the radicalism which is happening in Afghanistan, not staying inside Afghanistan borders, and it will affect far and wide different countries, regional and unfortunately other international or other, all international communities. I'm going to say we all Afghan citizens who we are inside the country or we are waiting in a bridging countries for our last destiny, and even the people who are in the third country and we are living in exile, we all of us victim of radicalism, victim of gender apartheid, victim of problems, challenges with the ruling system made for us. But still, we have the power. We have the power to make the de facto government responsive one, not only for Afghanistan nation, but for all international society. So let's join hands together to make Afghanistan a better place for all women and girls and for all nations. For this, we request, 1, no retreat from international accepted human rights law and regulations while engaging with the Taliban. Dear Presidents, we, women and girls from Afghanistan, we ask you to please, while the international society wanted to engage with the Taliban, do not have any setback. We do not want to see any setback from the accepted human rights rule and regulations. We need our own rights based on the international documents, based on the international regulations and laws. Afghan women and those who are more marginalized, like people with disability, all Afghanistan citizens, they want to see, they want to be represented within all peace process or all peace process building or making any strategic plan for the future of Afghanistan. We all need to be heard. Afghan women sound need to be heard, and we all need to be there. We all need to be heard from international society, and the Taliban need to know that that land, Afghanistan, is not just for them. We all Afghanistan people need to be there. Our voice need to be there. And the third recommendation from our side is that while your international society sending humanitarian assistance there as a response to this crisis, so having a contribution or an engagement with vulnerable people, including people with disability, and women should be a precondition from the donors. So let's join hands together again to make all world the much better place for all women and girls, including my land, Afghanistan. Thank you.
Je vous remercie, Madame Yacoubi. Comme on le sait tous, Excellences, distingués collègues, le temps ne pardonne pas. Nous allons donc devoir nous arrêter à ce stade, reprendre ce dialogue à 3 heures précises avec les 2 présentations qui demeurent à être faites par les personnalités qui sont venues donc discuter. Après la présentation faite par Madame la haute commissaire adjointe. Nous allons donc cet après-midi reprendre et aussi écouter les nombreuses délégations qui se sont inscrites sur la liste des orateurs dans le contexte de ce dialogue interactif. D'ici là, je vous souhaite un bon après-midi, un bon appétit et à tout à l'heure. Voilà. J'annonce donc la clôture de la 56e, de la première réunion au titre de la 56e session du Conseil des droits de l'homme et je vous remercie.